Chapter 1: A Promise Broken. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, sending me sliding forward on the leather seat. My gloved hands gripped the worn strap beside the window as the vehicle settled with a final creak of wood and metal. After 3 weeks of constant motion, first by train from Boston to Cheyenne, then 5 grueling days by stagecoach, the sudden stillness felt almost unnatural. "Timber Creek, end of the line, folks," the driver called out, his voice carrying through the dust-filmed windows. I drew in a deep breath, tasting the journey's grit between my teeth. My heart fluttered like a caged bird against my ribs, knowing that somewhere in this tiny settlement waited Harold Miller, my soon-to-be husband, whom I'd never laid eyes upon. 3 months of correspondence had led to this moment, a Boston schoolteacher venturing west to marry a man who promised steady work, a modest home, and decent prospects for the future. The driver pulled open the door, letting in a flood of bright Wyoming sunshine that made me squint after the dim interior. "Watch your step there, ma'am," he said, extending a weathered hand. I accepted his assistance, my legs wobbly from confinement. The heels of my best walking boots sank slightly into the dusty street as I steadied myself, one hand instinctively moving to secure my hat against the persistent prairie breeze. "That's your trunk there, ain't it?" the driver asked, already moving toward the rear boot. "The brown one with the brass fittings?" "Yes, thank you," I replied, my voice sounding strangely formal even to my own ears. I tugged at my traveling dress, navy blue wool that had seemed sensible in Boston but now felt stifling in the western heat. I brushed at the dust that had settled into every crease despite my best efforts with a small whisk broom during our brief stops. The driver hefted my trunk down with practiced ease. "Where you headed, ma'am? Got someone meeting you?" "I'm to meet my fiancé at the general store," I said, the word fiancé still foreign on my tongue. "Mr. Harold Miller." Something flickered across the driver's face, so quickly I might have imagined it, before he nodded. "Wilson's general store is just down the main street there, past the saloon. Can't miss it. Want me to carry your trunk that far?" "If it wouldn't be too much trouble." "No trouble at all for a lady," he replied, lifting the trunk with a grunt. I reached for my reticule to offer payment, but he waved me off. "Already taken care of, ma'am. Best of luck to you." As we walked, I took in my first real glimpse of Timber Creek. It was nothing like the bustling streets of Boston, with their brick buildings and gas lamps. Here, a single dirt road served as the main thoroughfare, lined with wooden structures in various states of weathering. A few horses stood hitched outside what appeared to be a saloon, their tails swishing against flies. Across the way, the blacksmith's forge announced itself with rhythmic clanging and wisps of smoke. At the far end, a white-steepled church stood like a beacon of civilization. It was smaller than I'd imagined from Harold's letters. He'd described a growing community with promise, but I counted fewer than 20 buildings in total. Still, I reminded myself this was to be my home now, and I would make the best of it. The sign for Wilson's General Store came into view, its black paint peeling slightly at the edges. My steps slowed involuntarily as anxiety rippled through me. Would Harold recognize me from the small tintype I'd sent? Would he be disappointed? What if I was disappointed in him? "This is it, ma'am," the driver said, setting my trunk down on the rough wooden planks of the store's porch. "Wilson's got just about everything you could need out here." "Thank you for your kindness," I said, smoothing my skirts one final time and adjusting my gloves. "I'm much obliged." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving me alone before the general store door. I drew in another steadying breath, squared my shoulders as Mother had taught me, and entered. A small bell tinkled overhead as I stepped inside. The store was larger than it appeared from outside, with shelves reaching to the ceiling packed with goods of every description. The scents of coffee, leather, tobacco, and spices mingled in the air. A few customers browsed the merchandise, glancing curiously in my direction. Behind a long wooden counter stood a plump woman in her 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked up at the sound of the bell, her gaze finding me immediately. Something in her expression, a sudden softening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, sent a chill down my spine. "Good day," I said, approaching the counter. "I'm Elizabeth Foster. I was told to meet Harold Miller here upon my arrival." The woman's hands, which had been folding a length of calico, went still. "Miss Foster," she said, her voice carrying a note that made my stomach clench. "I'm Mrs. Wilson. I'm afraid there's been a complication." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "Complication?" Mrs. Wilson glanced around at the other customers, then came around the counter. "Let's speak in my back room, dear." "Thomas, mind the store," she called to a young man stocking shelves. I followed her through a doorway hung with a heavy curtain, my mind racing with possibilities. Perhaps Harold was ill, or detained by business, or... The back room was small but neat, with a pot-bellied stove in one corner and a table with chairs in the center. Mrs. Wilson gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my fingers clutching the strings of my reticule so tightly they left impressions in my gloves. "What's happened to Mr. Miller?" I asked, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Mrs. Wilson's pitying look confirmed my worst fears before she even spoke. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, Miss Foster, but Harold Miller was married 3 weeks ago to Lucinda Perkins, the banker's daughter." The words struck me like physical blows. Married. 3 weeks ago. While I was already en route west, having given up my teaching position, my boarding house room, everything. There must be some mistake, I managed, though I knew there wasn't. The driver's expression, Mrs. Wilson's hesitation, they'd known. "I wish there was, dear." Mrs. Wilson's hand touched my arm gently. "He's claiming his letters explaining the change in circumstances must have been lost in transit. Of course he would claim that. A convenient excuse for a man who had made promises he never intended to keep. Heat rose to my face as humiliation washed over me. How many people in this tiny town knew I had come all this way to marry a man who had already taken another bride? I lifted my chin, calling on every ounce of dignity my mother had instilled in me over 24 years. "I see," I said, my voice only slightly tremulous. "Thank you for your directness, Mrs. Wilson." "Oh, you poor dear," she said, mistaking my composure for shock. "Please sit down, let me fetch you some water." I allowed myself to sink into the offered chair, grateful for its support as my knees had begun to tremble. The magnitude of my situation was becoming clear. Stranded in a frontier town, funds depleted by the journey, no return ticket, no position to go back to, and no prospective husband. Mrs. Wilson pressed a tin cup of water into my hands. "Drink this, you've gone white as a sheet." I sipped mechanically, the cool water doing little to ease the tightness in my throat. "Nonsense, it's no imposition at all," she patted my hand. "This town owes you that much at least, after what Harold's done." I wanted to protest further, to maintain some shred of independence, but practicality won out. I had nowhere else to go, at least not tonight. "Thank you," I said simply. "I'm in your debt." "Not at all." Mrs. Wilson rose from her chair. "Rest here a moment while I arrange for your trunk to be brought in. Would you like some tea?" I was just about to brew a pot. I nodded, grateful for the chance to compose myself. As Mrs. Wilson bustled out, leaving me alone with my thoughts, the full weight of my situation descended upon me. I'd traveled nearly 2,000 miles based on the promises of a man I'd never met, only to discover those promises were as insubstantial as the dust that coated my traveling clothes. What would I do now? Where would I go? The questions swirled in my mind like leaves caught in an autumn gale, with no answers forthcoming. For the first time since my parents' passing 3 years prior, I felt truly, utterly alone. Yet beneath the shock and humiliation, a small ember of anger began to glow. Harold Miller had betrayed me, yes, but I would not allow his actions to define my future. I was Elizabeth Foster of Boston, a woman who had survived loss before and come out stronger. Somehow I would find my way. I straightened my spine and waited for Mrs. Wilson to return, already considering what options might lie before me in this dusty frontier town that was to have been my home. The afternoon sunlight slanted through Mrs. Wilson's small window, casting golden rectangles across the rough wooden floor. I sat alone at the table, a piece of foolscap before me, tallying figures with a pencil stub Mrs. Wilson had kindly provided. The numbers refused to lie, no matter how many times I recalculated. $3.47. That's what remained of my savings after the long journey west. The stagecoach fare alone had been considerably more than I'd anticipated, and there had been unexpected expenses along the way: meals at way stations, a replacement for a broken bootlace, a small medicine for travel sickness that had proven useless against the endless jolting of the coach. I stared at the figures, willing them to transform before my eyes. A return ticket to Boston would cost at least $60, a small fortune and far beyond my current means. Even if I could somehow find the money, what awaited me there? My teaching position at Miss Peabody's Academy for Young Ladies had already been filled. My room at Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house had been let to another. I had no family remaining after mother and father succumbed to influenza 3 winters past. The pencil snapped between my fingers, startling me from my calculations. I stared at the broken halves, feeling they somehow represented my carefully constructed plans. A soft knock preceded Mrs. Wilson's entrance, bearing a tray with tea and what appeared to be freshly baked biscuits. The rich aroma of cinnamon wafted toward me, momentarily displacing my worries. "Thought you might need something to fortify you," she said, setting the tray down and pushing aside my pathetic arithmetic. "Nothing like a good cup of tea to help one think clearly." "You're very kind," I murmured, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Far kinder than I deserve as a stranger imposing on your hospitality," Mrs. Wilson snorted, a surprisingly unladylike sound from such a proper-looking woman. "Imposing? Hardly. And you're not a stranger. You're Elizabeth Foster from Boston, who came west in good faith, only to be treated shamefully by a man who should know better." She settled her substantial frame into the chair opposite mine. "Now, drink your tea and have a biscuit. Food always helps." I sipped the hot, sweet liquid, feeling its warmth spread through my chest. The biscuit tasted of cinnamon and molasses, reminding me inexplicably of childhood Christmases, and I felt tears threatening again. "I've been thinking about your situation," Mrs. Wilson continued, evidently giving me time to compose myself. "There might be a position available if you're amenable to staying in Timber Creek for a while." Hope flickered briefly. "A teaching position? No, I'm afraid not. We've not yet grown enough to support a proper school, though the children surely need one." She added more sugar to her tea, stirring thoughtfully. "It's Caleb Morgan, the blacksmith. His wife Sarah passed nearly 2 years ago, leaving him with 5 children to raise. The man's at his wit's end, trying to run his smithy and keep that household together. He's gone through 3 housekeepers already, and the last one left just yesterday, saying those children were wilder than a pack of coyotes." My spirits, momentarily lifted, sank again. A housekeeper. I'd spent years earning my teaching credentials, priding myself on my independence and education. To become a domestic servant felt like stepping backward. Mrs. Wilson must have read my expression. "I know it's not what you came west for, but it would be respectable work with room and board included. The pay's modest but fair. Caleb's a good man, just overwhelmed, and it would give you time to save for passage back east if that's still your desire, after you've given Timber Creek a proper chance." I stared into my teacup, watching the tiny leaves swirl in the amber liquid. What choice did I have, really? $3.47 wouldn't keep me fed for more than a week. "These children," I said finally. "What ages are they?" Mrs. Wilson's face brightened, sensing my capitulation. "Samuel's the eldest at 14, then the twin girls, Emma and Hannah, who are 12. Michael's 8, a handful that one, and little Sarah, named for her mama, just turned 4. Her expression softened. "The littlest hasn't spoken a word since her mother died. Doctor says there's nothing physically wrong, just grief stuck in her throat, poor lamb. 5 children, 1 silent with grief. A busy blacksmith father. No wonder 3 housekeepers had already fled." "And you believe Mr. Morgan would consider hiring me? I have no references here." "Heavens, child, at this point Caleb would hire old Nick himself if he promised to cook 3 meals a day and keep those children from burning the house down." She patted my hand. "Finish your tea, and, if you're willing, we'll walk over to the smithy and speak with him this afternoon." I nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you. I would appreciate that." A position as housekeeper was hardly what I'd dreamed of, but it would provide shelter and income while I gathered my wits and planned my next move, just until I could save enough to return east. An hour later, freshly washed and with my hair neatly repinned, I walked beside Mrs. Wilson toward the edge of town, where smoke rose steadily from the blacksmith's forge. My trunk remained at the general store, a practical decision until we determined whether Mr. Morgan would indeed hire me. "Fair warning," Mrs. Wilson said as we approached. "Caleb tends to be a man of few words. Don't take it as unfriendliness. He's just not one for unnecessary talk." The rhythmic clanging grew louder with each step, a steady percussion that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. The smithy itself was a large, open-sided structure with a sloped roof, adjacent to a modest but well-maintained two-story house. Heat shimmered in the air around the forge, and the smell of hot metal, coal, and sweat mingled in a distinctly masculine aroma. I hesitated at the threshold, momentarily intimidated by the hellish glow within and the shower of sparks that erupted as a hammer struck glowing metal. Mrs. Wilson showed no such reservation, marching directly into the workshop. "Caleb Morgan, got a moment to spare?" she called over the din. The hammering paused. A tall figure straightened from the anvil, setting the hammer down with deliberate care. He turned toward us, and I found myself taking an involuntary step backward. Caleb Morgan was unlike any man I had encountered in Boston's genteel drawing rooms. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to strain the seams of his leather apron, he seemed hewn from the same stuff as the iron he worked. His forearms, exposed by rolled sleeves, rippled with muscle and bore streaks of soot and sweat. A week's growth of dark beard shadowed his jaw, and his hair, a rich mahogany brown, curled damply at his temples and nape. It was his eyes that caught me most by surprise. Set beneath straight brows in a face tanned and weathered by sun and forge fire, they were a startling blue-gray, like a winter sky before snow. And though they held wariness and fatigue in equal measure, there was unmistakable kindness there too. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his apron, nodding a greeting. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice a deep rumble that matched his size. His gaze shifted to me, curious but not intrusive. "Caleb, this is Miss Elizabeth Foster," Mrs. Wilson announced with the air of someone delivering a long-awaited package. "She's newly arrived from Boston and in need of employment. Miss Foster, Caleb Morgan, finest blacksmith in 3 counties." I extended my hand, then wondered if that was too formal for the circumstances. Mr. Morgan settled the question by taking it briefly in his much larger one, his grip careful, as though aware of his own strength. "Ma'am," he said simply. "Mr. Morgan," I replied, pleasantly surprised by my steady voice. Mrs. Wilson wasted no time on further pleasantries. "I've told Miss Foster about your situation with the children and your need for household help. She's well educated, a teacher by profession, and I believe she might be just what you and those young ones need." His brows rose slightly at the word teacher, and something like hope flickered in his eyes before caution shuddered it away. "The position's for a housekeeper, not a governess," he said. "Can't afford fancy schooling on a blacksmith's wages." "I understand," I said quickly. "I assure you, Mr. Morgan, I'm not above cooking and cleaning." My mother ensured I learned all aspects of household management before I pursued teaching. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I fought the urge to fidget under that steady gaze, keeping my own level despite the heat rising to my cheek. "Better come inside," he said finally, untying his apron. "We should talk terms where it's cooler." He hung the apron on a hook, then called over his shoulder, "Taking a break, Ben. Mind the forge." I hadn't noticed the apprentice, a gangly youth of perhaps 16 who nodded from where he worked the bellows. We followed Mr. Morgan to the house, climbing 3 wooden steps to a porch that wrapped around the front. The door opened directly into a kitchen that even at first glance showed signs of domestic chaos. Unwashed dishes cluttered the dry sink, a basket of unfolded laundry occupied one chair, while a child's wooden horse lay on its side beneath the table. The floor had clearly not seen a broom in several days. "Children are with the pastor's wife this afternoon," Mr. Morgan explained, hastily clearing the table by simply moving items to an already crowded sideboard. "Please, sit." I perched on the edge of a kitchen chair, trying not to appear judgmental of the disarray while simultaneously assessing the workload such a household would entail. Mrs. Wilson settled beside me with the comfort of an old friend, apparently unsurprised by the condition of the home. Mr. Morgan remained standing, too large and too restless to sit. He raked a hand through his hair, leaving a smudge of soot on his forehead that I found myself wanting to wipe away. "I should be direct with you, Miss Foster," he began, his tone businesslike. "This isn't an easy position. 5 children, as I'm sure Mrs. Wilson told you. The twins, Emma and Hannah, are good girls mostly, but full of mischief when not properly occupied. Samuel," he sighed. "Samuel's angry since his mother died. Tests every boundary. Michael can't seem to stay still for more than a minute at a time, always into something. And little Sarah..." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Sarah hasn't spoken in nearly 2 years." I nodded, appreciating his candor. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned as much. The work's what you'd expect. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, keeping the children fed, clothed, and out of trouble. I can offer room and board plus $12 a month." The sum was modest indeed, but with lodging and meals provided, I could potentially save most of it. 6 months perhaps, and I'd have enough for passage back east. "I should warn you," he continued, 3 women have already tried and given up. Last one didn't even stay a full week, said my brood was impossible." I straightened my spine. "I spent 3 years teaching 27 young ladies from Boston's finest families, Mr. Morgan. I assure you, I'm no stranger to childish challenges." A flicker of something, amusement, respect, crossed his features. "Teaching's different from living with them day and night. These aren't just students you can send home at the end of the day." "I'm well aware of that," I replied, perhaps more crisply than intended. The implication that I didn't understand the difference rankled slightly. "Nevertheless, I believe I'm equal to the task, at least on a trial basis." Mrs. Wilson beamed approvingly. Mr. Morgan studied me again, his expression thoughtful. "Why?" he asked suddenly. I blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Why would a Boston school teacher want to be a housekeeper in Wyoming?" His gaze was direct, allowing no evasion. "Mrs. Wilson's too polite to say it, but news travels fast in a small town. I know you came to marry Harold Miller." Heat flamed in my cheeks, the humiliation of my circumstances washing over me anew. "Yes," I admitted, lifting my chin. "I did, and found him already married to another. My funds are insufficient for immediate return to Boston, and my previous position has been filled. I require employment, Mr. Morgan, and you require household help. It seems a practical arrangement for us both, at least temporarily." He nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with my honesty. "A practical arrangement," he echoed. "As good a basis as any, I suppose." He extended his hand again. "If you're willing to take on my wild bunch, Miss Foster, the position is yours." I rose and accepted his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of years of hard labor. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I accept your offer. When can you start?" "My trunk is still at Mrs. Wilson's store. Once it's delivered, I could begin immediately." "I'll send the wagon around for it within the hour," he said, already moving toward the door with long strides. "The children will be back by supper time. Your room's upstairs, first door on the right. It's small but private." Mrs. Wilson chuckled as we followed him outside. "Well, that's settled then. I had a feeling you two would suit." Mr. Morgan paused on the porch, a slight frown creasing his brow. "One more thing, Miss Foster. The children don't know yet that Miss Jenkins has quit. Might be best if you're simply there when they return. Less chance for them to plan mischief for the new housekeeper." The strategy surprised me, but I nodded my agreement. "As you think best, Mr. Morgan." He hesitated, then added in a softer voice, "They're good children, underneath it all, just hurting still. Their mother was..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "I understand," I said, and meant it. Loss was something I knew intimately. He gave a short nod and strode back toward his forge, the set of his shoulders suggesting the conversation had cost him more than the physical labor he was returning to. Mrs. Wilson patted my arm as we began walking back toward town. "You'll do fine, dear. Caleb's bark is worse than his bite, and those children need a firm but gentle hand." I murmured my agreement, but my mind was already racing ahead to the evening's introduction to 5 motherless children who had driven away 3 housekeepers before me. What had I gotten myself into? And yet, what choice did I have? As we passed the small church at the end of the street, I sent up a silent prayer for strength and patience. I would need both in abundance if I were to survive in this unexpected role, a makeshift mother to a blacksmith's children, far from the life I had planned. Chapter 2. The Wild Morgans. My trunk had been delivered and unpacked, my few possessions neatly arranged in the small upstairs bedroom that would now be mine. I'd spent the afternoon bringing some semblance of order to the kitchen, scrubbing dishes, sweeping floors, and taking inventory of pantry supplies, all the while wondering what manner of children would soon burst through the door. The rhythmic clanging from the smithy provided a steady backdrop to my thoughts, occasionally punctuated by the deeper ring of metal striking the anvil just so, sending its song echoing across the yard. By late afternoon, the kitchen gleamed with hard-won cleanliness. I'd discovered a ham bone and dried beans in the pantry, along with half a loaf of slightly stale bread that could be salvaged by toasting. A pot of bean soup now simmered on the stove, filling the house with a homey aroma that I hoped might ease my introduction to the Morgan children. The sudden silence from the forge told me the workday had ended. Soon after, I heard Mr. Morgan's voice from the yard, deeper than the others that accompanied it. My heart quickened as I smoothed my apron and patted my hair, checking that my simple chignon remained neat. First impressions mattered greatly, I knew, especially with children who had apparently made a sport of driving away housekeepers. The back door swung open with a bang that made me jump despite my mental preparations. A boy of about 8 shot through the opening like a cannonball, skidding to a halt when he spotted me by the stove. "Pa!" he hollered without taking his eyes from me. "There's a lady in our kitchen!" 2 girls appeared next, identical in feature, though one wore her light brown hair in a single braid while the other sported 2. They pressed together in the doorway, whispering and giggling behind their hands. A taller boy, surely the eldest, sauntered in with affected nonchalance that didn't quite mask his surprise, and finally, a tiny slip of a girl with wide blue eyes peeked around Mr. Morgan's legs as he entered. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on me, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. I forced my lips into what I hoped was a welcoming smile. "Children," Mr. Morgan said, removing his hat. "This is Miss Foster. She'll be keeping house for us now." "What happened to Miss Jenkins?" one of the twins asked, though the sly smile that accompanied the question suggested she knew perfectly well. "Miss Jenkins had to leave unexpectedly," Mr. Morgan replied, skillfully sidestepping the truth while hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Miss Foster has kindly agreed to help us." "How long's she staying?" the eldest boy asked, the question directed at his father as though I weren't present at all. "Week? 2? I noted the challenge in his tone, the unspoken reminder that I wasn't the first to stand in this kitchen, nor likely to be the last if the children had their way. "Samuel," Mr. Morgan said, a warning evident in that single word. He turned to me with a sigh that spoke volumes about the battles ahead. "Miss Foster, these are my children. Samuel is 14. He gestured to the sullen-faced boy who now leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed defensively across his chest. "The twins are Emma," he indicated the girl with the single braid, "and Hannah, the one with twin plaits. They're 12. The girls offered identical curtsies that might have been charming had they not been accompanied by barely suppressed giggles. "This whirlwind is Michael, 8 years old and perpetually in motion." The smaller boy, who had indeed been unable to stand still since entering, bobbed what might generously be called a bow. "And this," Mr. Morgan's voice softened as he placed a gentle hand on the tiny girl's head, "is Sarah. She'll be 5 come spring." Little Sarah regarded me solemnly, one finger in her mouth, the other hand clutching a well-worn cloth doll missing an arm. She made no sound, no gesture of greeting, just those enormous blue eyes studying me with an intensity that belied her tender age. "I'm very pleased to meet all of you," I said, directing my words to the children rather than their father. "I've made soup for supper, and I believe there are some apples for dessert." "Don't like soup," Michael announced, pulling a face. "We usually have beefsteak on Tuesdays," Hannah, or was it Emma, informed me with false helpfulness. "Miss Jenkins always made dumplings with the soup," added the other twin. I refused to be baited by these obvious attempts to find fault. Well, I'm still learning what everyone prefers. Perhaps tomorrow you can tell me your favorite meals, and I'll do my best to prepare them when supplies allow. Mr. Morgan cleared his throat. Children, go wash up for supper. Samuel, show Miss Foster to her room while the twins set the table. Samuel pushed away from the doorframe with an exaggerated sigh. This way, he muttered, heading for the stairs without checking if I followed. Girls, dishes and cutlery are in the sideboard, I said, pointing. Michael, would you please put 6 napkins on the table? They're in the drawer beneath the plates. The elder twin, Emma, I thought, raised an eyebrow. Miss Jenkins let us play until supper was ready. I'm not Miss Jenkins, I replied pleasantly but firmly. In this household, everyone contributes. Now please set the table while I see my room. I followed Samuel up the narrow staircase, feeling the weight of 4 pairs of eyes on my back. Only Mr. Morgan seemed to be on my side, and I suspected his support existed mainly because he was desperate for household help, not out of any particular faith in my abilities. Samuel led me to a small room at the front of the house, opening the door with a perfunctory gesture. Here, it's not much. The room was indeed modest. Space for a narrow bed, a small chest of drawers, and a rocking chair beneath the window that overlooked the main street. Someone, likely Mr. Morgan, had made an effort to prepare it, though. The bedding looked fresh, a small vase of wildflowers adorned the bureau, and the floor had been recently swept. It's perfectly adequate, thank you, I replied, trying to soften the boy's obvious resentment with kindness. Have you lived in this house your whole life, Samuel? He shrugged one shoulder, leaning against the doorframe in a posture that echoed his father's height and breadth, though he had yet to grow into the promise of either. Pa built it when he married Ma, I nodded, unsure how to respond to the mention of his mother. It's a fine house, sturdy. Ma kept it nice, he said, an accusation lurking beneath the simple statement. No one since had measured up, his tone implied. Certainly not me. I'm sure she did, I said softly. I'll do my best to honor her memory by caring for it properly. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps? That I hadn't risen to his bait? Before he could respond, we heard a crash from downstairs, followed by Mr. Morgan's voice calling for Samuel. You'd better come back down, Samuel said, already turning away. They've started without you. I followed him downstairs to find one of the twins, Hannah, I guessed from the double braids, standing amidst a scatter of broken crockery, her expression suspiciously innocent. I'm so clumsy, she lamented, in a voice that didn't match her smirk. I was just trying to help. Accidents happen, I said evenly, retrieving a broom from beside the stove. Please step back so you don't cut yourself. Mr. Morgan frowned. Hannah, that was your mother's serving platter. The girl at least had the grace to look somewhat abashed at that. Sorry, Pa. While I swept up the broken dish, the rest of the children continued setting the table with exaggerated care that seemed designed to mock rather than help. I noticed the twins exchanging glances and whispers, Michael fidgeting with barely contained energy, and Samuel watching it all with a slight curl of satisfaction to his lips. Only little Sarah remained apart from the mischief, sitting quietly in a small chair in the corner, clutching her one-armed doll. Her eyes followed me as I worked, missing nothing. Once the broken platter was cleared away, I ladled soup into the remaining bowls and placed slices of toasted bread on a plate. Supper's ready, I announced, trying to inject cheer into my voice despite the clear campaign of resistance already underway. The family settled around the table. Mr. Morgan at the head, Samuel to his right, the twins side by side opposite, and Michael fidgeting beside them. I helped little Sarah into a chair with a cushion that raised her to table height, then took the remaining seat at the foot of the table. Mr. Morgan bowed his head. For what we are about to receive, Lord, make us truly thankful. Amen. A chorus of mumbled amens followed, and then came the clatter of spoons against bowls. I was pleased to note that despite Michael's earlier complaint, he attacked his soup with enthusiasm. The twins picked more delicately, occasionally exchanging glances that didn't bode well. Samuel merely stirred his soup, taking infrequent, reluctant spoonfuls. Miss Foster, one of the twins began. Emma, I thought, though I still struggled to tell them apart. Where do you come from? Boston, I replied, helping Sarah steady her spoon. I taught at a girls' academy there. Why'd you leave? Samuel asked, his tone suggesting no good reason could possibly exist. I hesitated, unwilling to share the humiliating truth of Harold Miller's betrayal. I wanted a change, I said simply. To see more of our country. All the way to Wyoming? Hannah pressed. Seems awful far to come just for a change, Mr. Morgan intervened. Miss Foster's reasons are her own, girls. Mind your manners. Yes, Pa, they chorused with identical false sweetness. Where's the salt, Miss Foster? Emma asked suddenly. It's usually on the table. I believe it's in the pantry second shelf, I replied, rising. I'll get it. No, I can, Emma offered too quickly. Just the second shelf, you said? I believe so, yes, I answered, suddenly suspicious of her eagerness. The twins exchanged another of their meaningful glances. Emma returned momentarily with a small ceramic pot. Here you are, Miss Foster, she said, offering it to me first with exaggerated politeness. I accepted the pot cautiously, removing the lid to find not salt, but sugar. Thank you, Emma, but I believe this is sugar, not salt. Oh, she exclaimed with theatrical surprise. I'm ever so sorry. Hannah and I get them confused sometimes, don't we, Hannah? All the time, her sister agreed solemnly, though her eyes danced with mirth. I replaced the lid calmly. An easy mistake to make. Samuel, would you be kind enough to fetch the salt? I'm sure you know where it's kept. Samuel made no move to rise. Not my job to fetch and carry. Samuel, his father warned. It's quite all right, I interjected, not wanting to create a battle on my first evening. I'll find it myself. As I rose, Michael, who had been unusually still during this exchange, suddenly lurched sideways, his elbow catching his milk cup and sending its contents directly into my lap. Cold liquid soaked through my skirt instantly, making me gasp despite my best intentions. Oh no, he cried with the same false innocence his sister had employed earlier. It was an accident, Miss Foster. I stood, milk dripping from my skirt onto the floor. Mr. Morgan half rose, his expression thunderous. Michael Morgan, that was deliberate, and you know it! The boy's face fell, caught between defiance and genuine fear of his father's anger. The twins ceased their giggling, and even Samuel looked uncomfortable. I raised a hand, surprising myself with my outward calm despite the churning in my stomach. These children were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I broke. I'd faced similar tactics from my students at Miss Peabody's, albeit in more refined forms. Mr. Morgan, please, I said quietly. I'm sure it was truly an accident. I looked directly at Michael, whose eyes widened in surprise at my defense. However, Michael, even accidents have consequences. After supper, you'll help me mop the floor. I turned to the twins. Emma and Hannah, since you're so familiar with the pantry contents, you'll be responsible for properly labeling the salt and sugar containers tomorrow to prevent future confusion. Finally, I addressed Samuel. And Samuel, as the eldest, you have an opportunity to set an example for your siblings. I hope tomorrow you'll choose to demonstrate the kind of helpful behavior your mother would have been proud to see. A stunned silence fell over the table. Even Mr. Morgan appeared taken aback by my measured response. I used the moment to excuse myself briefly, retrieve a towel to blot the worst of the milk from my skirt, and return to the table with the salt cellar I'd located in the pantry. Now, I said, resuming my seat as though nothing unusual had occurred, shall we continue our supper? The soup will get cold. The remainder of the meal proceeded in relative quiet, the children exchanging glances but attempting no further mischief. Mr. Morgan watched me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Surprise, certainly, but perhaps a touch of respect as well. As we finished, I rose to begin clearing the dishes. Children, thank you for helping with the table setting. Tomorrow we'll establish a proper rotation of duties so everyone shares the work fairly. I turned to Mr. Morgan. With your permission, sir, I'd like to review the household routine with you once the children are settled for the night. He nodded, still studying me with that unreadable expression. Children, help Miss Foster clear up, then upstairs to wash. I'll be up shortly to say goodnight. To my surprise, they obeyed without protest, though not without exchanged glances that told me this battle was merely the first of many to come. Samuel stacked bowls with deliberate slowness. The twins whispered as they dried dishes I washed, and Michael, true to my directive, fetched the mop for the spilled milk. Only little Sarah remained apart, watching from her corner chair, those solemn blue eyes missing nothing. As the others filed upstairs, she approached me slowly, clutching her doll. She stopped just beside me, not speaking, not reaching, simply standing close enough that I could feel her small presence. I knelt to her level, careful not to loom or appear threatening. "Hello, Sarah," I said softly. "Would you like me to help you get ready for bed?" She didn't speak, but after a moment's consideration, she extended her tiny hand to me. My heart expanded painfully in my chest as I gently took those small fingers in mine. "We'll go upstairs and find your nightgown, shall we?" I said, keeping my voice gentle and matter of fact. As we passed Mr. Morgan in the hallway, his eyes widened at the sight of Sarah's hand in mine. "She doesn't," he began, then stopped himself. "Good night, little one. I'll be up to tuck you in shortly." Sarah nodded solemnly, maintaining her hold on my hand as we climbed the stairs. Whatever battles lay ahead with the Morgan children, I'd apparently won at least one small skirmish this evening. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was a beginning, and beginnings, I reminded myself, were often the hardest part of any journey. Dawn arrived with the insistent crowing of a rooster somewhere nearby. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling above me and the narrow bed beneath. The events of yesterday rushed back. Harold Miller's betrayal, Mrs. Wilson's kindness, and my introduction to the Morgan household with its 5 challenging children. Pale morning light filtered through the simple muslin curtains as I sat up, stretching muscles sore from yesterday's cleaning efforts. The house remained quiet. I'd risen early by habit, accustomed to the disciplined schedule of the academy in Boston. This would give me time to prepare a proper breakfast before the family awakened. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The latter would have to serve until I recovered the former. After washing and dressing, I made my way quietly downstairs, careful to avoid the 3rd step that had creaked beneath my weight last night. The kitchen stood empty and clean as I'd left it, early sunshine streaming through the eastern window to create pools of gold on the scrubbed wooden table. Outside, the smithy stood silent, awaiting Mr. Morgan's labor. A well-worn path led from the back door toward a small barn and chicken coop beyond. Acting on instinct, I followed it, morning dew dampening the hem of my dress. Sure enough, as I approached the coop, I spotted my boots placed conspicuously beside the door, their openings toward me. Cautiously, I peered inside one boot, then laughed softly despite myself. Both were filled to the ankle with chicken feed. A prank clearly designed to provoke outrage or, at minimum, frustrated inconvenience. I glanced toward the house, half expecting to see faces watching eagerly from windows, waiting for my reaction. Instead of emptying the boots in irritation, I simply opened the coop door and entered the small enclosure. A dozen or so hens clucked and fluttered at my intrusion, while a magnificent rooster, the author of my early awakening, eyed me suspiciously from his perch. "Good morning," I greeted them calmly. "I believe I brought your breakfast, though the delivery method is rather unconventional." I knelt, carefully tipping each boot to create small piles of feed on the dirt floor. The chickens approached eagerly, pecking at the unexpected bounty. While they ate, I investigated the nesting boxes built along one wall, discovering 7 perfect brown eggs nestled in the straw. "Thank you," I murmured to the nearest hen. "These will make a fine breakfast." Gathering the eggs in my apron, I retrieved my now empty boots and carried everything back to the house. The boots I left by the back door to be cleaned later. The eggs I brought into the kitchen, where I discovered little Sarah sitting at the table, still in her nightdress, her one-armed doll clutched to her chest. "Good morning, Sarah," I said, smiling at the solemn child. "You're up early." She didn't speak, of course, but her eyes followed me as I placed the eggs on the counter and stoked the cook stove to life. I felt no need to fill the silence with chatter. Something told me Sarah appreciated the quiet companionship as I moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Soon the rich aromas of coffee, frying bacon, and biscuits filled the air. I heard stirring from above, the household awakening to the smell of food. Before long, thundering footsteps heralded Michael's arrival, followed by the twins in matching nightdresses, their hair in sleep-tousled braids. All 3 skidded to a halt at the sight of me calmly cooking breakfast, their expressions comically disappointed. Samuel appeared next, his face carefully arranged in teenage indifference, though his eyes darted to my feet, noticing my church shoes rather than the missing boots. "Good morning, children," I said pleasantly. "I trust you all slept well?" "Where are your other shoes, Miss Foster?" Michael asked with forced innocence. Oh, they've been quite useful this morning, I replied, turning the bacon in the skillet. They made excellent containers for chicken feed. We'll have fresh eggs with our breakfast, thanks to your thoughtfulness. The twins exchanged glances of confusion while Samuel scowled, clearly disappointed by my failure to react as expected. Go dress for breakfast, please, I instructed, turning back to my cooking. We've a full day ahead. They retreated upstairs, whispering among themselves. Only Sarah remained, watching me with those enormous blue eyes. After a moment, she slid from her chair and approached, tugging gently at my skirt. Yes, dear? I asked, kneeling to her level. She pointed to a drawer, then to the table. Would you like to help set the table? I guessed. A solemn nod was my answer. I opened the drawer she'd indicated, finding it full of cutlery, and showed her how to place forks and knives at each place setting. She worked with careful precision, tiny brow furrowed in concentration, her doll tucked beneath one arm. Mr. Morgan entered as we finished, already dressed for the day's work, his hair damp from washing. He stopped short at the sight of his youngest helping me, his expression softening in a way that transformed his entire face. Morning, he said, his deep voice gentle as he addressed his daughter. You're being helpful, Sarah girl. She nodded, a glimmer of pride in her eyes as she straightened the last fork. Good morning, Mr. Morgan, I greeted him. Breakfast will be ready shortly. The children are dressing. His gaze moved from Sarah to me, noting my changed footwear, but making no comment. You found the chickens then, he said instead. Indeed, they were most appreciative of the feed. A flicker of amusement crossed his features before he mastered it. The children giving you trouble already? Nothing I can't manage, I assured him. Children test boundaries. It's perfectly natural. He studied me with new consideration as he poured himself coffee from the pot I'd prepared. 3 housekeepers before you would disagree? Perhaps they took the mischief personally, I suggested, removing golden biscuits from the oven. It rarely is. Children who've lost a mother have many feelings they don't know how to express properly. The other children returned, properly dressed, though somewhat rumpled, in time to hear this observation. Samuel's scowl deepened, but I noticed the twins exchange a different sort of glance than before, something almost uncertain. Breakfast proceeded with less resistance than supper had offered. The food disappeared quickly, especially the eggs, which I'd scrambled with a bit of cheese found in the pantry. Even Samuel cleaned his plate, though he maintained his stoic silence throughout. As they finished eating, I cleared my throat. Before everyone begins their day, I'd like to discuss the household routine. 5 pairs of eyes regarded me with varying degrees of wariness. Mr. Morgan leaned back in his chair, coffee cup in hand, watching with interest. In my experience, I continued, a household runs most smoothly when everyone understands their responsibilities. I produced a sheet of paper on which I'd written a simple schedule during the quiet morning hours. I've created a rotation of chores appropriate to each person's age and abilities. We know our chores, Samuel muttered. We don't need a fancy list. Perhaps not, I acknowledged, but this ensures the work is distributed fairly. See here? I pointed to the chart. Everyone has daily tasks, but they rotate weekly, so no one is always stuck with the least pleasant duties. The twins leaned forward despite themselves, interested in the novelty if nothing else. Michael fidgeted but listened. Additionally, I continued, I believe good work deserves recognition. I produced a second paper. For each completed task, you'll earn a check mark. At week's end, check marks can be exchanged for small privileges. An extra slice of dessert, perhaps, or first choice of Sunday activities. Bribes, Samuel scoffed, though I noticed a hint of interest beneath his disdain. Incentives, I corrected gently. Even adults appreciate being recognized for their contributions. Mr. Morgan set down his cup with a decisive clink. It's a sound system. We'll give it a try. He stood, signaling the end of discussion. I'll be in the forge until noon. Samuel, you're to split and stack that cord of wood delivered yesterday before school. Yes, sir, Samuel replied, the respectful words at odds with his sullen tone. Girls, help Miss Foster clear up, then get your books. Pastor Williams expects you at 9 sharp for lessons. Mr. Morgan looked at me. The twins and Samuel attend school at the parsonage 3 days a week. Pastor teaches the older children from town. I nodded, pleased to learn education wasn't being entirely neglected. And Michael and Sarah? Michael should go too, but Mr. Morgan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Can't sit still, the boy supplied, surprisingly self-aware. Pastor says I disrupt the other children. I see, I said thoughtfully. Well, perhaps Michael can help me this morning, and we'll have our own lessons later. Michael's eyes widened in surprise, clearly expecting punishment rather than inclusion. Mr. Morgan nodded approval before turning to leave. At the door, he paused. Ms. Foster, might I have a word outside? I followed him onto the back porch, morning sunlight illuminating the strong planes of his face beneath his perpetual stubble of beard. Up close, I noticed flecks of gold in his blue-gray eyes, like sunlight on river stones. About the children, he began, his voice pitched low. They're testing you, seeing how far they can push. I'm aware, I assured him. It's to be expected. He studied me, seeming to measure something in my expression. Most women would have packed their bags after finding their shoes in the chicken coop. I'm not most women, Mr. Morgan, and they're just shoes, easily cleaned. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, you're not like the others. He glanced toward the house, his expression sobering. They've been through much. Sarah was barely 3 when their mother died. She doesn't remember a time before, but the others, they remember everything. I finished softly. And they're angry that she left them. Surprise registered in his eyes. Yes. Children often misunderstand death as abandonment, I explained, and anyone who tries to take their mother's place becomes a target for that anger. You sound as though you speak from experience. I thought of my own parents, taken by influenza when I was barely 21. I do, though I was much older than your children when I lost my parents. Old enough to understand death wasn't a choice they made. Something in his expression shifted, a recognition of shared grief that needed no further explanation. Will you stay then, despite their best efforts to drive you away? The question surprised me with its directness. I intend to, yes, at least until I've saved enough to... I stopped myself, suddenly reluctant to remind him of my eventual plan to return east. Until you've saved enough to leave, he finished, no judgment in his tone. Fair enough, but while you're here... While I'm here, I'll do my best for them, I promised. Children need stability, clear expectations, and consistent consequences, both positive and negative. He nodded slowly. Sarah, my wife, used to say something similar. He straightened, the moment of shared understanding passing, as he resumed his role as employer. I should get to the forge. Horseshoes won't make themselves. Throughout the morning, I implemented my new system, showing the chart to each child before they departed for their respective duties. Samuel left for his wood splitting with obvious reluctance. The twins gathered their books with whispered consultations, and Michael alternated between helping me and climbing every available surface in the kitchen. To my surprise, Sarah remained my constant shadow, following me from room to room as I began the day's cleaning. She carried her doll in one arm and, after watching me sweep, retrieved a small handkerchief from her pocket and began dusting the lower shelves I couldn't reach. I praised her efforts, earning a shy, almost smile that transformed her solemn face. By mid-morning, the twins and Samuel had departed for their lessons at the parsonage, and I'd set Michael to sorting a basket of mismatched socks while I tackled the upstairs bedrooms. Each room told its own story. Samuel's sparse and deliberately untidy, the twins crowded with treasures and trinkets arranged on every surface. Michael's a chaos of toy soldiers and collected rocks. And Sarah's neat but somehow unlived in, as though she spent as little time there as possible. The state of their rooms further confirmed my assessment of each child's nature, strengthening my resolve to address their individual needs rather than treating them as a collective challenge to be overcome. When I descended to check on Michael, I found him proudly displaying neatly paired socks alongside a small pile of those without matches. Even more surprising, he'd swept the kitchen floor, clumsily but with obvious effort. "Look, Miss Foster," he exclaimed. "I did extra work. How many check marks do I get?" "1 for the socks as assigned," I said, examining his work, "and a bonus for taking initiative with the floor. Well done, Michael." His face lit with such genuine pleasure that I glimpsed the child beneath the mischief maker, a boy desperate for positive attention, willing to work for it when given proper direction. Sarah tugged at my skirt, pointing to the shelves she'd dusted. "And you've earned a check mark too," I told her, marking the chart. "Excellent dusting." From outside came the rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil, a sound I was already beginning to find oddly comforting in its steadiness. Through the window, I could see Mr. Morgan at his forge, muscles flexing beneath his rolled sleeves as he shaped glowing metal with practiced precision. Occasionally, he glanced toward the house, and once, catching my eye through the glass, he nodded slightly, acknowledgement, perhaps, of the relative peace that had descended upon his usually chaotic home. I turned back to the children, a curious sense of accomplishment warming me despite the knowledge that this was merely the first skirmish in what promised to be a lengthy campaign. "Now," I said, rolling up my sleeves, "who would like to learn how to make gingerbread?" Michael's hand shot up instantly, and Sarah nodded with unprecedented enthusiasm. As I helped them measure flour and spices, I found myself smiling more genuinely than I had since arriving in Wyoming territory. Perhaps this unexpected detour in my life's journey might prove valuable after all. Not merely a means to save money for my eventual return east, but an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of 5 children who needed precisely what I had to offer. Chapter 3: Seeds of Attachment. A week passed in the Morgan household, each day bringing small victories and inevitable setbacks as I established my place among them. The twins still whispered and giggled, but now sometimes included me in their jokes rather than making me their target. Michael's boundless energy remained challenging, but I discovered that giving him specific physical tasks redirected his impulses toward productivity, and little Sarah shadowed me everywhere, her silence persisting but her trust clearly growing as she sought my company over all others. It was while helping the twins with their reading one evening that I made a concerning discovery. Hannah stumbled over words that should have been familiar to a girl her age, while Emma, clearly the more advanced reader, grew impatient waiting for her sister. "Don't you practice your lessons from Pastor Williams?" I asked, noticing similar gaps in their knowledge of basic arithmetic. "Not really," Emma admitted with a shrug. "Pa's too busy to help, and Samuel won't. Pastor only sees us 3 days a week," Hannah added, "and there's too many children for him to check if we've done our assignments." This revelation led me to examine Samuel's schoolwork, finding his penmanship nearly illegible and his compositions full of creative spellings that suggested a bright mind hampered by inconsistent instruction. Even Michael, when I tested him on basic letters and numbers, showed alarming gaps in knowledge that would make formal schooling difficult when the time came. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, I approached Mr. Morgan as he sat before the fire, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. "Mr. Morgan," I began, taking the chair opposite his, "I'm concerned about the children's education." His hand stilled on the carving, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Pastor Williams is well educated, graduated from a seminary back east." "I'm sure he is," I agreed, "but 3 partial days a week with multiple age groups isn't sufficient, especially without supervised practice between sessions. The children are falling behind where they should be," he sighed, setting aside his whittling. "Sarah, my wife, was teaching them at home. After she passed," he gestured vaguely. "There hasn't been time, and the housekeepers weren't equipped for teaching." I leaned forward, warming to my subject. "I'd like to establish evening lessons after supper. Nothing burdensome, just an hour or so to reinforce what Pastor Williams covers and fill in the gaps. With your permission, of course." Mr. Morgan studied me with those penetrating blue-gray eyes, his expression thoughtful. "You're already managing the house and 5 unruly children. Taking on teaching as well seems above and beyond your duties." "Teaching is my profession, Mr. Morgan," I reminded him. "And truly, an educated household will be easier to manage in the long run. Children with nothing to occupy their minds find mischief all too readily." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That's certainly true." He considered for a moment. "Very well, if you think it would help. Though I warn you, Samuel especially has resisted any attempts at schooling since his mother died." "Leave Samuel to me," I said with more confidence than I truly felt. "I've handled reluctant learners before. The next evening, after supper, I announced the new addition to our routine. Children, please clear the dishes, then bring your school books back to the table. We're going to have lessons for an hour before bedtime. The reactions were exactly as I had anticipated. Groans from Michael, eye-rolling from the twins, and outright refusal from Samuel. I don't need extra schooling, he declared, pushing back from the table. I'm old enough to be done with books entirely. Are you planning to take over your father's forge someday? I asked mildly, gathering the empty plates. He paused. Of course I am. I'm already learning the trade. Excellent. Then you'll need mathematics for measuring and accounting, reading for correspondence with suppliers, and writing to record orders and keep ledgers. I stacked the dishes in the wash basin. Unless you plan to hire someone to manage those aspects of the business? Samuel frowned, clearly never having considered these practical applications of education. Pa handles all that himself. Indeed he does, I agreed. Because he has the necessary skills, do you? Mr. Morgan, leaning against the doorframe watching this exchange, raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing me to manage the situation. Samuel's stubbornness warred visibly with his ambition. Finally, he exhaled sharply. Fine, 1 hour, no more. That's all I ask, I said, careful not to sound too triumphant. Now please help Michael clear the table while I fetch some additional materials from my room. To my private amusement, by the time I returned with my teaching supplies, Samuel had not only helped clear the table, but had stationed himself at it, with his books open before him, as though to prove he was taking the exercise seriously on his own terms. I began with Michael and Sarah, setting them simple copying exercises to improve their penmanship, while I assessed the twins' arithmetic skills. Mr. Morgan surprised me by sitting at the far end of the table, ostensibly reviewing some papers related to the smithy, but I noticed how his attention repeatedly drifted to our activities. Hannah, try this method, I suggested, showing her a different approach to a division problem that had been frustrating her. Sometimes looking at a question from another angle makes the answer clearer. Her face brightened as understanding dawned. That's much easier. Emma, look how Ms. Foster does it. Soon, both girls were working steadily through problems that had stymied them before, occasionally competing to see who could finish first. Michael, typically unable to sit still for more than minutes at a time, remained surprisingly focused on the letter copying game I'd devised, where each correctly formed letter earned him a point toward a small reward. Even little Sarah, though still silent, showed remarkable concentration as she traced letters with her tiny finger, occasionally glancing up at me for approval, which I freely gave with smiles and gentle pats on her hand. Only Samuel remained aloof, working independently on an essay Pastor Williams had assigned, his posture radiating reluctant compliance rather than engagement. I allowed him his space, understanding that pride often prevents direct acceptance of help, especially from a newcomer who represented changes he hadn't requested. As I circulated among the other children, I casually mentioned, "When I taught in Boston, my students particularly enjoyed our history discussions. We were studying the Revolutionary War when I left. Such fascinating figures involved in those events." I didn't look directly at Samuel, but I noticed his pencil pause on the page. "Did they really dump all that tea in the harbor?" Michael asked, momentarily distracted from his letters. "They did indeed," I replied, launching into a vivid description of the Boston Tea Party that emphasized the courage and principles of the participants rather than dry dates and facts. By the time I finished the tale, even Samuel had abandoned any pretense of working on his essay, his attention captured despite himself. When I described Paul Revere's famous ride, his hand slowly raised. "Yes, Samuel," I acknowledged, as though his participation had been commonplace rather than unprecedented. "Pastor Williams said Revere never actually completed his ride, that he was captured by the British. Is that true?" "It is," I confirmed, pleased by his critical thinking. The famous poem by Longfellow takes certain liberties with historical fact. Revere was indeed stopped by a British patrol. It was actually a man named Samuel Prescott who completed the ride to Concord. "Samuel?" Michael piped up. "Like our Samuel?" "Yes," I smiled. "A fine name with a place in history. Many important American figures have been named Samuel." The eldest Morgan straightened almost imperceptibly at this, a flicker of pride crossing his usually guarded features. Perhaps tomorrow evening, I suggested as our hour drew to a close, we might discuss more about the Revolutionary period. I find it helps to understand the context of events rather than merely memorizing their sequence. Could we? Emma asked eagerly. Pastor Williams just has us copy dates from the book. It's ever so dull. I believe we could arrange that, I replied, gathering the papers and books. You've all worked very well tonight. Michael, you've earned your 5 points. You may choose an extra story or a piece of molasses candy before bed. Candy, he exclaimed predictably, bouncing in his seat. As the children dispersed to prepare for bed, Mr. Morgan approached, those riverstone eyes appraising me with new consideration. You've missed your calling, Ms. Foster, he said quietly. I've never seen Samuel voluntarily participate in schooling since... He paused. Well, in a long while. Samuel is intelligent, I replied simply. He merely needs to see the purpose in what he's learning. Mr. Morgan nodded, a thoughtful expression softening his features. My Sarah would have approved of your methods. She always said education should be a joy, not a burden. The comparison to their beloved mother caught me by surprise, a peculiar warmth spreading through my chest at what I recognized was his highest possible praise. Thank you, I murmured. That means a great deal. He held my gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he cleared his throat and stepped back. Good night, Miss Foster. Good night, Mr. Morgan. As I climbed the stairs to check on the children before retiring myself, I realized with mild surprise that I'd gone the entire evening without once thinking of my plans to return east. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. I'd come to Wyoming territory with such specific intentions: marriage to Harold Miller, a new life in the West. And when those plans crumbled, I'd immediately reoriented toward returning to Boston. Yet here I was, finding unexpected satisfaction in teaching 5 motherless children and earning the respect of their taciturn father. I pushed the confusion aside as I tucked the blankets around little Sarah, who was already drifting to sleep, her one-armed doll clutched tightly to her chest. There would be time enough to sort out my future. For now, I had responsibilities to these children who were, ever so tentatively, beginning to trust me. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the September air carrying just a hint of the autumn to come. You all look very fine, I approved as we gathered in the kitchen, where Mr. Morgan waited in his Sunday suit, so different from his usual forge-stained attire that he seemed almost a stranger. You've worked miracles, Miss Foster, he said, surveying his transformed brood with obvious pleasure. I'd forgotten what they look like properly cleaned. The twins preened at the compliment, while Samuel merely tugged at his collar as though it were strangling him. Little Sarah, in a white dress that had clearly been her mother's handiwork, with delicate embroidery at the collar and hem, slipped her tiny hand into mine with the trust that still humbled me each time she offered it. We walked together to the small white church at the end of Timber Creek's main street, joining other families making their way toward Sunday worship. I felt eyes upon us as we approached, whispers barely disguised behind gloved hands. News of my arrival as Harold Miller's intended bride and my subsequent employment with the Morgan family had clearly circulated thoroughly throughout the small community. Just hold your head high, Mr. Morgan murmured beside me, his deep voice pitched for my ears alone. Timber Creek lives on gossip, but it dies without fuel. I nodded gratefully, straightening my spine as Mother had taught me, determined not to show how the whispers and stares affected me. We entered the church together, the Morgan family and their housekeeper, taking a pew near the center, where the children could see without being too close to the pulpit's direct scrutiny. As the congregation settled, I became aware of a disturbance near the door, new arrivals being shown to a pew across the aisle and slightly ahead of ours. My heart stuttered painfully as I recognized Harold Miller's profile, and beside him a petite blonde woman in an elaborate dress that outshone every other woman's Sunday best by several degrees. Lucinda Perkins Miller, the banker's daughter who had claimed the husband promised to me. My hands trembled slightly in my lap as I forced myself to look away, heat rising to my cheeks at the mortification of sitting in church mere feet from the man who had betrayed me and the woman he had chosen instead. Little Sarah, seemingly attuned to my distress, pressed closer against my side. On my other side, Mr. Morgan shifted almost imperceptibly, his broad shoulder coming to rest against mine in what felt like deliberate support rather than accidental contact. I glanced up, meeting his eyes briefly, and found them hard with a protectiveness that took me aback. The service began, Pastor Williams leading the congregation in a hymn. I rose with the others, my voice joining the communal singing despite the tightness in my throat. Throughout the service, I felt Harold's gaze occasionally drift in my direction, though I steadfastly avoided meeting it, focusing instead on the children beside me. Helping Michael find the correct page in the hymnal, quieting the twins with a gentle look when they began whispering, steadying Sarah on the pew between hymn and seated portions. When it came time for the greeting of peace, my stomach knotted with dread at the possibility of having to exchange pleasantries with Harold and his wife. But before anyone could approach our pew, Mr. Morgan rose, effectively blocking the aisle with his imposing presence, and ushered his family, including me, into a tight circle of handshakes and murmured "Peace be with you" that excluded all others until the moment had passed. The gesture wasn't lost on the congregation, nor, I suspected, on Harold himself. Caleb Morgan had made a statement without speaking a word. The new housekeeper was under his protection and part of his family circle, regardless of her previous connection to Harold Miller. As we filed out after the final blessing, Harold made a deliberate move to intersect our path, his wife on his arm like a fashionable accessory. "Miss Foster," he began, his voice carrying the forced heartiness I now recognized as artificial. "How wonderful to see you settling into our community, and with the Morgans no less. Quite a change from what you might have expected, I imagine." Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't embarrass either of us, Mr. Morgan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of me. "Miller," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Mrs. Miller, if you'll excuse us, we're expected at the Williams home for Sunday dinner." Without waiting for a response, he guided his family, and me, past the couple and down the church steps. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, grateful for his intervention, yet somewhat chagrined at needing it. "Thank you," I murmured as we walked, the children ranging ahead of us on the path toward the parsonage. That was most uncomfortable. "Man's a fool," Mr. Morgan replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than comforting. "Showing off his banker's daughter while embarrassing the woman he wronged? No decent man would behave so." His straightforward defense warmed me more than flowery consolation might have. "Still, I appreciate your protection. It can't be comfortable for you having your housekeeper be the subject of town gossip." He glanced down at me, sunlight catching the gold flecks in his eyes. "Ms. Foster, I've been the subject of town gossip since Sarah died. First, for being unwilling to court the eager widows and spinsters who brought more casseroles than my children could eat. Then, for my inability to keep a housekeeper longer than a month. Your presence has likely only added another chapter to an already well-established tale. Despite everything, I found myself smiling at his dry assessment. Well, when you put it that way, I suppose we make a fine pair of scandal makers." Something flickered in his expression at the word pair, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Indeed," he said simply, then raised his voice to call Michael back from where he'd wandered toward the creek bank. As we approached the parsonage, where several other families were gathering for the Sunday meal that followed services, I realized I felt oddly protected within the orbit of the Morgan family, even with all their challenges, and the temporary nature of my position among them. Today, Caleb Morgan had shown me a kindness I hadn't expected, standing as buffer between me and the man who had humiliated me. Seeds of attachment, I realized with mild alarm, were being sown in ground I'd intended to keep fallow. I would need to be careful to remember that my time in Timber Creek was meant to be brief, just long enough to save passage back east. These tentative bonds forming between myself and the Morgan children, and perhaps their father as well, would only make that eventual departure more difficult for everyone concerned. Yet as little Sarah's hand slipped trustingly back into mine as we climbed the parsonage steps, I couldn't bring myself to regret the connection, however temporary it might prove to be. The afternoon following our church attendance passed in quiet Sunday activities, the children permitted to read or play simple games, while I prepared a cold supper of leftover ham, biscuits, and apple preserves. Mr. Morgan retreated to the front porch with a pipe and newspaper brought from the general store, his customary Sunday respite from both forge and family demands. Monday morning dawned gray and threatening, the distant rumble of thunder suggesting the dry spell we'd enjoyed might soon end. I hurried through hanging the laundry, hoping to beat the rain, while the older children departed for their lessons with Pastor Williams. Michael, as usual, remained home with Sarah, his boundless energy made worse by the dropping barometric pressure that seemed to infuse him with an extra measure of restlessness. "Michael, please stop rolling that hoop in the house," I finally said after his wooden toy had upended a basket of clean linens. "Why don't you help me teach Sarah her letters instead?" He groaned dramatically, but abandoned the hoop, flinging himself into a kitchen chair with such force it skidded several inches across the floor. "Letters are boring," he declared. "Sarah doesn't care about them anyway." I ignored his complaint, retrieving a slate and chalk from the shelf where I kept teaching materials. Little Sarah already sat at the table, watching me with those solemn blue eyes that missed nothing. "Now then," I said, drawing a large A on the slate. "This is the letter a Sarah. Can you trace it with your finger?" She did so carefully, her tiny finger following the lines with surprising precision for one so young. "Excellent," I praised. "A is for apple, and—" I thought a moment, then smiled. "A is for anvil, like your papa uses in his forge." "And axe," Michael contributed unexpectedly. "Pa forges axe heads, too." "Very good, Michael." I drew a B beside the A. "Now B is for—" "Blacksmith," Michael supplied, apparently warming to the game when it connected to his father's work. We continued through several letters, Michael increasingly engaged in finding forge words, while Sarah traced each letter with careful concentration. As we reached MM, I recalled a simple alphabet song my mother had taught me as a child, one that had helped me remember the connection between letters and sounds. "Would you like to learn a song that helps remember the letters?" I asked. Without waiting for a response, I began to sing softly, pointing to each letter as I named it in the lilting tune. A is for apple, so round and so sweet. B is for bread that we happily eat. Michael watched with mild interest, but Sarah's eyes widened, her focus intensifying as I continued through the alphabet in verse. When I finished, I smiled at her. "Shall we try again? Perhaps you can join me this time," I began once more, my finger tracing each letter as I sang. To my delight, Michael's voice joined mine on the second line, his enthusiasm making up for his questionable pitch, but it was at the letter Mem that the miracle occurred. "M is for mother who loves you so dear," I sang, and then, so faint I nearly missed it, a whisper joined the final words, "loves you so dear." My voice faltered as I turned to Sarah, scarcely believing what I'd heard. Her lips were parted, eyes fixed on the slate. "Sarah," I said softly, "would you like to sing more?" She hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I continued, my heart thundering against my ribs. "N is for night when the stars appear." "Stars appear," came the fragile echo, slightly louder now, no longer a whisper but a small, sweet voice that had been silent for nearly 2 years. Michael gasped, his fidgeting arrested mid-mater. "Sarah's talking!" he exclaimed, nearly overturning his chair as he bolted upright. Pa, come quick, Sarah's talking!" He tore from the room, screen door slamming behind him as he raced toward the forge, leaving me alone with the little girl, whose silence had finally broken. I knelt beside her chair, careful not to overwhelm her with my own emotional response to this breakthrough. "Sarah," I said gently, "your voice is beautiful. Would you like to sing the rest of the song with me?" She nodded, a tiny smile lifting the corners of her mouth, the first real smile I'd seen from her. Together we continued, her voice gradually strengthening as we worked through the alphabet. We had just reached Z when thundering footsteps announced Michael's return. Mr. Morgan close behind him, his forge apron still tied around his waist and soot streaking one cheek. "Sarah," he said, his deep voice uncommonly gentle as he knelt beside his youngest. "Honey, did you speak?" Sarah looked from her father to me, then back again, her tiny face solemn once more, but with a new spark in her eyes. Song, she said simply, the single word falling into the kitchen silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of astonishment. Mr. Morgan's sharp intake of breath was the only sound for several heartbeats. Then, to my amazement, I saw moisture gather in those blue-gray eyes before he blinked it rapidly away. "A song?" he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Will you sing it for me?" Sarah looked at me, clearly seeking reassurance. I nodded encouragement, and together we began again from the beginning of the alphabet song. Her voice remained soft but grew more confident with each letter, especially when her father joined in, his deep bass providing a foundation for her delicate soprano. By the time the twins and Samuel returned from their lessons, caught in the rain that had finally begun to fall, the kitchen had become an impromptu concert hall. Sarah sat on her father's lap, singing the alphabet song for the third time, Michael providing enthusiastic, if somewhat creative, harmony. "What's happening?" Samuel asked, rain dripping from his hat brim as he stood in the doorway. "Sarah's talking," Michael announced triumphantly. "Miss Foster taught her a song, and she started singing, and now she's talking again." The twins rushed forward, questions tumbling over each other while Samuel remained rooted in place, an expression of disbelief giving way to something more complex. Relief mingled with a hint of resentment, as though he'd just witnessed a miracle he wasn't entirely ready to accept. "It's just a few words so far," I cautioned, not wanting them to overwhelm Sarah with expectations. "But it's a wonderful beginning." Mr. Morgan's eyes met mine over Sarah's head, a depth of emotion in them I'd never seen before. "Thank you," he said simply, those two words carrying more weight than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. I felt warmth rise to my cheeks under his intense gaze. "I only taught her a song my mother sang to me. Sarah did the rest herself when she was ready." For the remainder of the day, Sarah spoke occasionally, single words mostly, sometimes two together, as though testing a rusty hinge that had finally received oil. Each utterance brought a hush to whatever activity was underway, all of us still adjusting to the marvel of her recovered voice. Even Samuel softened toward me, grudgingly acknowledging my role in his sister's breakthrough with a muttered, "Good work with Sarah," as he helped carry firewood inside. That evening, after the children had gone to bed and Mr. Morgan had retired to his room, I climbed the stairs to my own chamber, bone-weary but filled with a quiet joy that made the fatigue insignificant. As I pushed open my bedroom door, I stopped short at the sight that greeted me. On my pillow lay a small bouquet of wildflowers. Purple asters, golden black-eyed Susans, and sprigs of late-blooming clover tied with a faded blue hair ribbon I recognized as Sarah's. Beside it sat her one-armed cloth doll, clearly left as a deliberate offering. Tears sprang to my eyes at the simple gesture from a child who had found her voice again and chosen this way to express her gratitude. I touched the flowers gently, then picked up the doll, noticing for the first time how its remaining arm had been carefully stitched back on several times, the thread colors varying where repairs had been made. This was no casual gift, but the sacrifice of a treasured possession. I couldn't keep the doll, of course, but the gesture itself was a gift beyond price. Carefully placing the flowers in the small vase on my bureau, I carried the doll back to Sarah's room, intending to return it to her bed without waking her. I eased her door open to find her sitting upright, moonlight from the window illuminating her expectant face. Clearly, she had been waiting for me to find her gifts. "Thank you for the beautiful flowers, Sarah," I whispered, approaching her bed, "and for sharing your special doll with me. But I think she belongs with you, don't you?" Sarah shook her head, pushing the doll back toward me when I tried to tuck it beside her. "Keep safe," she whispered, her two-word sentence catching me by surprise. "You want me to keep her safe for you?" I clarified, deeply touched by her trust. She nodded solemnly. "I'd be honored," I said, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. "Would you like to visit her in my room sometimes?" Another nod, followed by the ghost of a smile. "Then I'll take very good care of her, I promise." I leaned down to kiss her forehead, breathing in the clean scent of soap and childhood. "Sleep well, dear one." "Night," she whispered, her eyes already drifting closed as she snuggled beneath her quilt. I returned to my room, carefully placing the doll on my pillow where she would be visible from the doorway should Sarah come looking. The day's events swirled in my mind as I prepared for bed. Sarah's first words, Mr. Morgan's emotional reaction, the changed atmosphere in the household that had been building gradually but had crystallized today into something I couldn't quite name. As I drifted towards sleep, I realized with mild alarm that I had not thought once of Boston or my plans to return east in nearly a week. Somehow, without my noticing, Timber Creek had begun to feel less like exile and more like I stopped myself before the word home could fully form in my consciousness. This arrangement was temporary, I reminded myself firmly. I must not forget that, no matter how attached I might become to the Morgan family. Or they to me. The rain continued for 3 days, a steady downpour that transformed Timber Creek's dusty main street into a river of mud and confined the Morgan children to the house with increasing restlessness. By the third afternoon, even my best efforts at indoor activities had been exhausted. The twins had quarreled over knitting needles, Michael had constructed and demolished a fort of sofa cushions, Samuel brooded by the window watching rivulets race down the glass, and even Sarah had grown fractious, her newly discovered voice employed primarily in single-word complaints. Bored, she announced for the third time in an hour, abandoning the rag doll I'd helped her construct as a companion for the one-armed doll that now resided in my room. I glanced out the window toward the forge, where smoke continued to rise despite the weather. Mr. Morgan had orders to fill, rain or shine, and had spent most of the past 3 days at his anvil while we remained housebound. Suddenly, an idea formed. "Children," I said, closing the book I'd been attempting to read aloud over their fidgeting, "would you like to visit your father at the forge? Perhaps he could show you what he's working on." 5 faces turned to me with varying degrees of interest and surprise. "In the rain?" Hannah asked dubiously. "We'll wear coats and boots," I replied. "It's not far, and I suspect you'd all benefit from a change of scenery. Pa doesn't like us underfoot when he's working," Samuel said, though I noticed he'd perked up at the suggestion. "Says it's dangerous." "I'll speak with him first," I promised. "If he agrees, we'll be very careful and follow his instructions exactly. If not, we'll devise another activity." This compromise satisfied them enough that preparations began immediately. Boots located, coats buttoned, Sarah bundled into an oversized shawl that had once been her mother's. I donned my own coat and borrowed an umbrella from the stand by the door. "I'll check with your father first," I reminded them. "Wait here until I return." I dashed through the rain to the smithy, the packed dirt path now slick with mud that threatened to claim my boots with each step. The heat emanating from the open-sided structure hit me like a wall as I approached, a welcome contrast to the chilly dampness outside. Within, Mr. Morgan stood at his anvil, stripped to his shirt despite the weather, sleeves rolled to the elbows as he shaped a glowing length of metal with rhythmic hammer blows. I waited for him to place the cooling metal in a water barrel before clearing my throat to announce my presence. He turned, surprise evident in his expression as he wiped his forearm across his damp brow. "Miss Foster? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," I assured him quickly. "I apologize for interrupting your work. The children are growing rather restless with the confinement, and I wondered if it might be possible to bring them to observe you working for a short while. A change of scene might settle them before supper." He regarded me thoughtfully, glancing around the forge as though assessing its suitability for visitors. "It's not the safest place for children," he said slowly. "There's fire, hot metal, sharp tools." "I understand," I said, hiding my disappointment. "I'll find another diversion for them." "However," he continued, surprising me, "if they stay in the designated safe area and follow instructions exactly, it might be educational for them to see the process." A slight smile softened his features. "Samuel especially should learn more about the trade if he's to follow me in it someday." "Thank you," I said, genuinely grateful. "Impress upon them the importance of proper behavior and safety." He nodded, then added, "Might be good for Sarah, too. She used to enjoy watching me work before—" He trailed off, the familiar shadow crossing his features whenever he referenced his late wife indirectly. "She's been expanding her vocabulary hourly," I told him, hoping to ease his melancholy. This morning she said, "Samuel took my ribbon," a complete sentence. His smile returned, warming his eyes. "Did she? And did Samuel take her ribbon?" "He claims it was the twins, but I have my suspicions," I replied, sharing his amusement. "I'll fetch them now, if you're certain it won't disrupt your work too badly." "I'll manage," he said, turning back to the forge to stoke the coals. "Ben's late again today, so another pair of hands, even small ones, might actually help." I returned to the house, where 5 expectant faces greeted me. "Your father has agreed," I announced, "but with strict conditions. You must stay where he tells you, follow every instruction immediately, and remember that his workshop contains many dangerous elements." They nodded solemnly, even Michael momentarily subdued by the responsibility being placed upon him. We made our way through the rain, Sarah riding on Samuel's back to keep her tiny boots from being swallowed by the mud. The twins huddled together under a shared umbrella, whispering excitedly, while Michael splashed through every puddle with deliberate enthusiasm. The forge's warmth enveloped us as we entered, steam rising from our damp clothes almost immediately. Mr. Morgan had cleared a space along one wall, placing several crates as makeshift seats a safe distance from the forge itself. From this vantage point, the children could observe without being underfoot. "Welcome to my humble establishment," he said with uncharacteristic formality, giving a small bow that made Sarah giggle from her perch on Samuel's shoulders. "Please be seated and the demonstration will begin." The children arranged themselves on the crates, surprisingly compliant in this novel environment. I remained standing behind them, ready to intervene should anyone's attention wander toward the more dangerous areas of the smithy. Mr. Morgan began by showing them the forge itself, explaining how the coal fire was maintained at different temperatures for various tasks. He demonstrated how to heat a metal rod until it glowed first red, then orange, then nearly white. "The color tells me when the metal is ready to work," he explained, holding up the glowing rod with long tongs. "Too cool, and it won't shape properly. Too hot, and it becomes brittle." He moved to the anvil, where he began shaping the rod with hammer blows, each strike precise and controlled, despite the obvious force behind it. I'd observed him from a distance before, but never up close like this. The play of muscles beneath his shirt, the concentration in his face, the skill in his calloused hands, all revealed a mastery of his craft I hadn't fully appreciated. "What are you making, Pa?" Michael asked, leaning forward eagerly. "This will be part of a gate hinge for Mr. Peterson's new corral," he replied, never pausing in his rhythmic strikes. "But the same techniques apply whether I'm making something simple like this or something more complex." "Like what?" Emma asked. Mr. Morgan placed the cooling metal in water, sending up a hiss of steam before answering. "Like this," he said, reaching for a cloth-covered object on a nearby workbench. He unwrapped it to reveal an ornate iron candlestick, its stem twisted in an elegant spiral, its base adorned with delicate leaf patterns. The twins gasped in admiration while even Samuel looked impressed. "You made that?" he asked, a new respect evident in his voice. "I did," Mr. Morgan confirmed. "Blacksmithing isn't just for horseshoes and hinges, it can be art as well as craft." I studied the candlestick with genuine appreciation. "It's beautiful," I said. "I had no idea you created such things." He met my gaze, something almost shy in his expression. My Sarah encouraged me to explore the artistic side of metalwork, said I had a gift for it. She was right, I said softly. An unexpected moment of connection passed between us, broken when Michael predictably asked, "Can I try hammering something?" Mr. Morgan chuckled, returning the candlestick to its cloth wrapping. "Not the hot metal, but I've something you might manage." He produced a small sheet of thin copper and a wooden mallet. "Come here, carefully, and I'll show you how to make a simple design." He placed the copper on a flat section of the anvil, then guided Michael's small hand on the mallet, helping him tap a pattern of small dents that caught the light. The boy's face shone with pride at the result. The twins were next, each allowed to try the same technique with different patterns. Even Sarah was lifted to tap the copper a few times, her delighted "pretty" bringing a smile to her father's face that transformed his usually stern features. When Samuel's turn came, Mr. Morgan selected a different project. "You're old enough to try something more challenging," he said, producing a length of iron wire. Watch how I bend this using these specialized pliers. With deft movements, he shaped the wire into a simple but elegant hook. Your mother used these for hanging her herbs to dry, he explained, his voice softening at the memory. Now you make one. Samuel approached the task with uncharacteristic concentration, his movements less fluid than his father's, but determined. The result was slightly asymmetrical, but recognizably a hook. Well done, Mr. Morgan approved, inspecting the work. With practice, you'd make a fine smith. The pride that bloomed on Samuel's face struck me deeply. For all his sullenness and resistance, he clearly craved his father's approval. Perhaps more than the other children, being old enough to shoulder the weight of becoming the man of the family in his mother's absence. Mr. Morgan turned to me next, catching me by surprise. Would you like to try, Miss Foster? I hesitated, glancing down at my entirely unsuitable attire. I'm afraid I'm not dressed for ford work. Not the heavy work, he assured me. Perhaps something more delicate. Curiosity overcame hesitation, and I stepped forward. Very well, but you must promise not to laugh at my clumsy efforts. Never, he said with unexpected seriousness, his eyes holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. He selected a thin brass wire and demonstrated how to form it into a circle using round-nosed pliers. The trick is to maintain even pressure, he explained, his voice close to my ear as he guided my hands on the tools. I was intensely aware of his proximity, the heat of him more noticeable even than the forge's warmth. His hands, large and work-roughened, enveloped mine with surprising gentleness as he helped me complete the circle, then twist the ends to secure them. Now for the design, he said, producing a tiny hammer. Tap lightly. It doesn't require force, just precision. Under his guidance, I managed to create a pattern of small indentations around the circle's edge. When finished, he took it from me and attached a small loop at the top, then held it up to the light. A perfect pendant, he declared. Needs only a ribbon or chain. It's lovely, I said, genuinely pleased with the result. I'd never have imagined I could make something like this. Everyone has capabilities they don't recognize until given the opportunity to try, he replied, handing me the pendant. Keep it as a reminder. Our fingers brushed as I accepted it, sending an unexpected flutter through my chest that had nothing to do with pride in my handiwork. I tucked the pendant into my pocket quickly, flustered by my own reaction. Thank you for the demonstration, Mr. Morgan, I said, my voice more formal than I'd intended. Children, it's time we return to the house to prepare supper. The chorus of protests was expected, but half-hearted, as even Michael had begun to tire in the forge's heat. We gathered our wraps, preparing to dash back through the rain, when Mr. Morgan stopped us. Wait, he said, disappearing into a small room at the back of the smithy. He returned with a large oilskin tarp. Use this to keep dry. Samuel can hold it over all of you. As we huddled beneath the makeshift canopy for our return journey, I found myself in the center of the Morgan family. Sarah's small hand in mine, the twins pressed against either side, Michael darting in and out of our shelter despite my admonishments, and Samuel above us all, stoically holding the tarp as high as his 14-year-old arms could manage. I glanced back once to see Mr. Morgan watching us from the forge doorway, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. When he raised his hand in farewell, I returned the gesture, the brass pendant, a small weight in my pocket that somehow felt more significant than its size would suggest. That evening, as the children chattered excitedly over supper about their forge adventures, I found my gaze drawn repeatedly to Mr. Morgan's hands. The same hands that had shaped metal with such strength, now carefully cutting meat for Sarah's plate, passing biscuits, and occasionally pushing back a lock of hair that fell across his forehead. Artist's hands, I thought, unexpectedly. Creator's hands. And something within me shifted, a subtle realignment of perception that both intrigued and alarmed me. I had come to see Caleb Morgan as Sarah's father, as my employer, as a skilled blacksmith, but today I had glimpsed something more, the tenderness with which he guided his children, the pride in Samuel's accomplishment, the beauty he could create from raw metal. I forced my attention back to my plate, disturbed by the direction of my thoughts. I was here to save money for my return east, not to develop inconvenient attachments to a widowed blacksmith with 5 children and a heart still clearly devoted to his departed wife. Whatever flutter I had felt in the forge was merely appreciation for craftsmanship. Nothing more. But later, as I prepared for bed, I found myself removing the brass pendant from my pocket, turning it in the lamplight to admire its simple elegance. On impulse, I threaded it onto a narrow ribbon from my sewing basket and tied it around my neck, the metal warm against my skin as I extinguished the lamp and lay in darkness. Just a keepsake, I told myself firmly, a memento of an educational afternoon, nothing more. But even as sleep claimed me, I knew the lie in my own thoughts, and in my dreams I felt again the gentle strength of his hands guiding mine, shaping not metal but something far more malleable and dangerous. My own carefully guarded heart. Chapter 4. Changing Seasons. The October morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight spilling through my bedroom window in golden shafts that promised a fine autumn day. I stretched beneath the quilt, savoring the moment of peace before the household stirred to life. A glance at the small clock on my bureau confirmed it was just past 6, early enough to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee before the children awakened. As I dressed, I caught sight of my reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Something had changed in my countenance over the past weeks. A softening around the eyes, perhaps, or a settled quality that hadn't been there when I first arrived in Timber Creek. The woman who stared back at me seemed more assured, more present than the bewildered and humiliated bride who had stepped off the stagecoach a month ago. The realization struck me suddenly. Today marked exactly 1 month since I had entered the Morgan household as their housekeeper. 1 month of struggles and small victories, of gradually earning the children's trust and establishing routines that had transformed chaos into relative order. 1 month longer than any previous housekeeper had managed to endure the challenges of 5 motherless children. I fastened the brass pendant Caleb had helped me create at the forge to a ribbon around my neck, tucking it beneath my high collar where it rested like a secret against my skin. The small weight had become a talisman of sorts, though I was careful never to display it openly, unsure how to explain its significance even to myself. The house was quiet as I descended the stairs, everyone still abed as I'd hoped. I built up the kitchen fire, filled the coffee pot, and was just enjoying my first sip when I heard a suspicious rustling from the pantry. Setting down my cup, I moved quietly to investigate. The pantry door stood slightly ajar, whispered voices and the clink of crockery emanating from within. I eased it open to discover all 5 Morgan children crowded into the small space, surrounded by flour, sugar, eggs, and what appeared to be every bowl in the kitchen. "Oh!" Emma exclaimed, nearly dropping the egg she held. "You weren't supposed to be up yet." "We're ruined," Hannah lamented dramatically. "What on earth are you doing?" I asked, surveying the chaos. Flour dusted every surface, including Michael's hair, which stood on end as though he'd been shocked. Sarah's pinafore bore suspicious brown smears that looked like chocolate, while Samuel attempted to shield something behind his back. "It was supposed to be a surprise," Michael said, disappointment evident in his voice. "We're making you a cake," Sarah announced, her vocabulary expanding daily, though she still spoke primarily in short phrases. "Special day?" "A cake?" I echoed, genuinely touched. "Whatever for?" The children exchanged glances before Samuel, with unusual forthrightness, explained. "You've been here a month today, longer than anyone else." "Pa said it was worth celebrating," Emma added. "That you've brought order to our chaos." "Though he didn't say it quite like that," Hannah qualified with a giggle. "We wanted to surprise you at breakfast," Michael said mournfully, "but we're making a terrible mess of it." Indeed they were. What I assumed was cake batter spattered the walls, floor, and children in equal measure. But the effort itself, 5 children risen early to create something special for me, warmed my heart beyond measure. "What a wonderful thought," I said, genuinely moved. "Perhaps we can salvage this project together? I'm surprised, regardless of whether it comes at breakfast or dinner." Relief washed over their flour-dusted faces. "You're not cross about the mess?" Samuel asked warily. "Messes can be cleaned," I replied, rolling up my sleeves. Thoughtfulness like yours is far rarer and more precious. Now, shall we see what can be done with this batter? For the next hour, we worked together to create something resembling a cake. The original recipe had apparently been Emma's attempt to recreate her mother's special chocolate cake, but with ingredients measured by enthusiasm rather than precision. We adjusted as best we could, and by the time the other children set the table for breakfast, Sarah and I had managed to coax a lopsided but fragrant cake into the oven. We'll have it after supper, I decided, wiping flour from Sarah's nose. A proper celebration. Mr. Morgan appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows. "Seems I've missed some excitement," he observed, his deep voice carrying a note of amusement. "The surprise is somewhat compromised, but the sentiment remains intact," I told him, brushing flour from my own skirts. "Your children are remarkably thoughtful." "They've had a good example these past weeks," he replied, his eyes meeting mine with warm sincerity that sent an unexpected flutter through my chest. The day proceeded with its usual routines, lessons for the older children at the parsonage, household chores, meal preparations, but an undercurrent of anticipation ran beneath it all. The children whispered among themselves, occasionally dissolving into giggles when I approached. Even Mr. Morgan seemed to be harboring some secret, disappearing to the forge for longer than usual in the afternoon. By supper time, I had grown quite curious about these mysterious preparations. The children insisted on setting the table themselves, shooing me from the kitchen on the pretext of needing to ice the cake in private. I retreated to the front porch, where the October evening painted the western sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. "Been exiled, have you?" Mr. Morgan's voice came from behind me, and I turned to find him approaching from the direction of the forge, something concealed in his hand. "Quite firmly," I agreed with a smile. "Apparently I'm not to witness the final cake preparations," he chuckled, coming to stand beside me at the porch railing. "They've been plotting all week, you know. Samuel even used his own money to buy chocolate from Wilson's store." The knowledge that the normally resistant Samuel had contributed his precious pennies to the celebration touched me deeply. "I'm overwhelmed by their thoughtfulness," I admitted. "When I first arrived, I wouldn't have believed such a transformation possible." "The transformation isn't just in them," he said quietly. "This household, this family, has been reborn under your care, Miss Foster." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. "I've only done what needed doing," I demurred. "No," he countered gently. "You've done far more. You've brought light back into a home that had grown dark with grief and neglect." The children smile again. Sarah speaks. "Even Samuel has stopped wearing his anger like armor." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I too find myself changed by your presence." My heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. Before I could formulate a response, he extended his hand, opening it to reveal a small object wrapped in soft cloth. "I made this," he said, "a small token of appreciation for all you've done for us." With fingers that trembled slightly, I accepted the gift, carefully unwrapping the cloth to reveal an iron bookmark, shaped like a quill pen. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the feather's veins delicately detailed, the nib tapering to a fine point, the whole piece polished to a soft luster that caught the evening light. "It's beautiful," I breathed, running my finger along the smooth metal. "Truly a work of art." "I noticed how carefully you handle your books during evening readings," he explained. "Thought you might find use for it." The thoughtfulness of the gift, how he had observed my habits, created something specifically suited to me, rendered me momentarily speechless. This was no casual gift, but one designed with genuine consideration. "Thank you," I managed finally. "I shall treasure it always." Something shifted in his expression then, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of lips, as though he might say more. For a breathless moment, I thought he might reach for my hand where it rested on the porch railing beside his. The space between us seemed charged with unspoken possibility. "Supper's ready," Michael's voice shattered the moment as he burst through the front door. "And you have to come see the cake, Miss Foster." The spell broken, Mr. Morgan straightened, that familiar reserve settling over his features once more. "Best not keep them waiting," he said with a small smile. "They've worked hard for this moment." The kitchen table had been transformed in our absence. A clean tablecloth, one I recognized as being saved for special occasions, covered its scarred surface. The children had arranged wildflowers in a mason jar at the center, and the mismatched dishes had been set with unusual precision. At one end stood the cake, its chocolate icing applied with more enthusiasm than skill, listing slightly to one side but surrounded by 5 proudly beaming faces. "Surprise," they chorused as we entered. "Happy 1-month day." "We made it ourselves," Michael announced unnecessarily, given the evidence of chocolate still smudged on his cheek. "Mostly," Emma qualified with a giggle. "It's the most wonderful surprise I've ever received," I told them truthfully, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't quite contain. "Thank you all." Supper became a festive affair, with each child eager to recount their favorite moments from the past month. Hannah recalling how I'd shown her a new stitch for her sampler, Michael describing proudly how I hadn't scolded when he accidentally broke a plate, Emma praising my patience with their lessons. Even Samuel contributed, gruffly acknowledging that my methods of teaching history made it somewhat interesting, high praise indeed from him. Sarah, her vocabulary expanding daily since that breakthrough moment with the alphabet song, surprised us all by standing on her chair and announcing clearly, "Miss Foster makes us happy again." Mr. Morgan's eyes met mine across the table as he helped his youngest back into her seat. "Indeed she does," he agreed softly. Later, as I prepared for bed, I found myself cradling the iron bookmark in my palm, admiring its perfect balance and elegant design. 1 month. How quickly it had passed, and how different my perception of my situation had become. When I first accepted this position, I had marked off days in my journal, counting toward the moment I would have saved enough to return east. Now I realized with a start I had stopped counting entirely. The pages of my journal had filled instead with accounts of the children's progress, small domestic triumphs, and observations of Timber Creek and its inhabitants. Somewhere, without my noticing, my focus had shifted from escape to engagement, from enduring to living. The realization was both comforting and alarming. I had come to Wyoming with such clear intentions: marriage to Harold Miller, or, failing that, a swift return to the life I knew in Boston. Instead, I found myself increasingly bound to this place, these children, and most disturbingly their father, whose quiet strength and unexpected gentleness had begun to occupy more of my thoughts than I cared to admit. I placed the bookmark carefully on my nightstand where moonlight caught its polished surface. Whatever uncertainties the future held, I could not deny the present truth. I was no longer merely passing through these people's lives. I had begun, irrevocably, to put down roots. "Are you certain this is enough food?" I asked Mr. Morgan as he loaded the last basket into the wagon. "There will be 9 of us, after all," he chuckled, securing the tailgate. "The entire town brings dishes to share, Miss Foster. Your apple pies and fried chicken will be more than sufficient for our contribution." The annual Timber Creek Harvest Celebration had been the primary topic of conversation among the Morgan children for days, held on the sprawling meadow behind the church on the 3rd Saturday of October. It was apparently the social event of the season, with games, music, food competitions, and a bonfire after sunset. I smoothed my skirts nervously, having chosen my second best dress for the occasion, a forest green wool with black piping that complemented my auburn hair. The children were similarly attired in their Sunday best, faces scrubbed to gleaming, hair tamed with extra attention. Even Mr. Morgan had donned a clean shirt and his best waistcoat, his usually untamed beard trimmed neatly for the occasion. The wagon journey to town was filled with excited chatter, the children speculating about the day's events with unbridled enthusiasm. Sarah sat beside me on the bench, her small hand tucked trustingly in mine, occasionally offering a single-word commentary on passing sights. Mr. Morgan handled the reins with practiced ease, his shoulder occasionally brushing mine as the wagon jolted over ruts in the road. "Will there really be a pie contest, Miss Foster?" Hannah asked from the wagon bed behind us. "So I'm told," I replied, careful not to reveal my private hope that my apple pies might place well. Mrs. Wilson had assured me my recipe was exceptional, but I knew from experience that small towns often had long-established hierarchies in such matters. "Mrs. Peterson always wins," Emma informed me, a hint of challenge in her voice. "But I think yours are better." "We'll soon see," I said lightly, though their confidence warmed me. "I'm sure all the entries will be delicious." As we approached the church, I could see dozens of wagons already parked along the perimeter of the meadow. Trestle tables had been arranged in a large rectangle, laden with dishes covered by cloths to protect them from dust and insects. At one end, a judging table displayed pies, cakes, and preserves awaiting evaluation. Children darted about in games of tag, while men gathered near a makeshift horseshoe pit. Women clustered in conversational groups, many turning to observe our arrival with undisguised interest. "The Morgan family enters society," Mr. Morgan murmured beside me, a hint of sardonic humor in his voice. "Prepare yourself, Miss Foster. You're about to face more scrutiny than you encountered even on your first Sunday at church." "I can't imagine why," I replied, though I knew perfectly well. The Morgan children's reputation for driving away housekeepers was well established, and my continued presence, now entering the 5th week, was apparently worthy of community speculation. As Mr. Morgan helped me down from the wagon, I felt the weight of curious gazes. The children scrambled down without assistance, immediately forming a protective cluster around me as though they sensed the coming inquisition. "I'll take your pies to the judging table," Mr. Morgan offered, lifting the carefully covered basket. "We'll come too," Michael declared, the other children nodding in agreement. Surrounded by my small entourage, I approached the judging area where 3 older women, clearly the social arbiters of Timber Creek, presided with the gravity of Supreme Court justices. They watched our approach with varying expressions of surprise and curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Peterson, Mrs. Whitaker, Mrs. Jenkins." Mr. Morgan greeted them with a polite tip of his hat. "May I present Miss Foster's contribution to the pie competition?" The eldest of the 3, a silver-haired woman with piercing blue eyes, looked me over appraisingly. "So, you're the Boston school teacher who's taken on the Morgan brood," she said without preamble. "Heard you've lasted longer than the others combined." Before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward, announcing clearly, "Miss Foster makes the best pies, and she teaches us letters." The judges exchanged glances of undisguised astonishment at hearing the formerly silent child speak. The youngest judge, Mrs. Jenkins, recovered first. "Well, let's see these famous pies, shall we?" I unwrapped my offerings. 2 apple pies with lattice crusts, the pastry golden and flaky, the filling visible through the woven dough rich with cinnamon and nutmeg. The fragrance rose temptingly as I set them on the table. "Dutch apple with a touch of maple," I explained, fighting the urge to fidget under their scrutiny. "My mother's recipe, though I've added a few personal touches." Mrs. Peterson leaned forward to inspect the crimping along the edges, her expression revealing nothing. "Very neat work," she allowed finally. "We'll announce winners before the bonfire lighting." Taking this as dismissal, we moved away to find a spot to spread our blanket for the day's festivities. The children darted off to join various games once I assured them they could go, though I noticed they made a point of returning frequently to check on me, as if concerned I might feel abandoned. "They're quite protective of you," Mr. Morgan observed, helping me arrange our blanket beneath a broad oak tree with a good view of the festivities. "I've never seen them so unified in purpose." "What purpose is that?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Making sure everyone knows you belong with them. Notice how they keep introducing you? Listen." I turned my attention to where the twins were speaking with another girl their age. "That's Miss Foster," Emma was saying importantly. "She lives with us now. She was a teacher in Boston, but she teaches us at home every evening." Similar scenes played out throughout the afternoon. Michael proudly told anyone who would listen that our Miss Foster had taught him to write his letters properly. Samuel, in a surprising display of public loyalty, corrected a boy who referred to me as the new housekeeper with a curt, "She's more than that. She's part of our family now." Each such declaration sent a complicated ripple of emotion through me. Pleasure at their acceptance, wariness at the deepening attachment, concern about the expectations it might create. I was, after all, still an employee with plans to eventually return east, wasn't I? The afternoon passed pleasantly, with games, music from a fiddle and banjo duo, and more food than the entire town could possibly consume. I found myself drawn into conversations with other women, answering questions about Boston, teaching, and yes, how I managed the notorious Morgan children. It's simple, really, I explained to Mrs. Wilson and several other curious listeners. They're bright, spirited children who needed structure and genuine engagement. Their mischief was merely a cry for attention. You make it sound so straightforward, Mrs. Jenkins marveled. Those twins reduced me to tears when I tried watching them for just one afternoon while their father took Samuel to Cheyenne last spring. They can be creative in their troublemaking, I acknowledged with a smile. But they're also creative in their kindness when properly encouraged. As I spoke, I glimpsed Mr. Morgan watching me from across the gathering, an unreadable expression on his face. When our eyes met, he didn't look away as most would, but held my gaze steadily until Sarah tugged at his hand, breaking the moment. The sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the meadow as preparations for the bonfire began. Men stacked wood in a carefully constructed pyramid, while children gathered at the judging table where the contest winners would soon be announced. "Come on, Miss Foster," Michael called, racing back to grasp my hand. "They're going to say who won." I allowed him to pull me toward the gathering crowd, Mr. Morgan falling into step beside us. The three judges stood before their table with the solemnity of royalty about to bestow honors. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, raising her hands for silence. "The Preserves Prize goes to Mrs. Wilson for her blackberry jam," she announced, to polite applause and Mrs. Wilson's pleased smile. Various other categories followed. Best cake, Mrs. Whitaker's own daughter; best bread, the miller's wife; best pickles, Mrs. Peterson herself, to no one's surprise. Finally, they reached the most anticipated category. For best pie, Mrs. Jenkins declared, "First prize goes to Mrs. Peterson for her huckleberry pie, a Timber Creek tradition." A ripple of unsurprised applause followed as Mrs. Peterson accepted the small blue ribbon with practiced modesty. The Morgan children's faces fell in disappointment around me. "Second prize," Mrs. Jenkins continued, "goes to Miss Elizabeth Foster for her Dutch apple pie with maple, a most welcome new addition to our celebration." A cheer erupted from the Morgan contingent, startling me with its enthusiasm. The twins actually jumped up and down while Michael shouted, "That's our Miss Foster!" as though no one could possibly be confused about which Elizabeth Foster was being honored. As the bonfire was lit, sending sparks spiraling upward to meet the emerging stars, the celebration's mood shifted from boisterous to contemplative. Families gathered on blankets to watch the spectacle, children's energy finally beginning to wane as darkness fell. Musicians struck up slower, more melodic tunes, and couples moved to a flattened area to dance in the firelight. The Morgan children, exhausted from a day of play and excitement, sprawled on our blanket in various attitudes of contentment. Sarah had already fallen asleep with her head in Hannah's lap, while Michael fought a losing battle against drooping eyelids. Even Samuel seemed relaxed, his usual wariness softened by the day's simple pleasures. "They won't last much longer," Mr. Morgan observed, his voice low beside me. "But I hate to end their day just yet. Let them rest a while," I suggested. "The wagon will be comfortable enough for the ride home, even if they're asleep." He nodded agreement, then surprised me by rising and extending his hand. "Walk with me? The sunset over the creek is worth seeing, and we can still keep the children in view from there." I hesitated only briefly before placing my hand in his, allowing him to help me to my feet. We moved away from the blanket, not so far as to lose sight of the children, but enough to create a small pocket of privacy in the gathering dusk. The creek burbled softly as we approached its bank, water catching the bonfire's distant glow in flashes of gold and crimson. Beyond, the sunset painted the western sky in deepening shades of amber and purple, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening east. "You've brought something special to our family, Miss Foster," Mr. Morgan said after a comfortable silence. "I watched you today with the children, with the townspeople. You belong here in a way I wouldn't have predicted when you first arrived." His words echoed my own earlier thoughts so closely that I couldn't immediately respond. When I did, honesty compelled me to acknowledge the reality of our arrangement. "I'm deeply attached to the children," I admitted, "more than I expected to become. But we both know my position is temporary. Eventually I'll return east. Will you?" he asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the sunset rather than my face. "Is that still your plan?" The question hung between us, weighted with implications neither of us had voiced. I found myself unable to give the firm affirmation that would have come so readily a month ago. I don't know anymore, I confessed finally. My life in Boston seems increasingly distant, like a story I read rather than lived, yet I came west with such specific intentions. To marry, he supplied when I trailed off, to build a life with a partner. Yes. Another silence fell, comfortable despite the undercurrent of unspoken possibilities flowing beneath it like the creek beside us. Gradually, I became aware that our hands rested side by side on the rough bark of a fallen log where we'd seated ourselves, his little finger almost but not quite touching mine. The small distance seemed charged with significance, a boundary neither of us had yet gathered courage to cross. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his hand until his smallest finger overlapped mine, the contact so slight it might have been accidental but for the intentionality I sensed in the movement. My breath caught at the simple touch, more affecting in its restraint than any bold gesture could have been. "Elizabeth," he said softly, using my given name for the first time. Miss Foster!" Michael's voice shattered the moment, approaching at his usual headlong pace. "Hannah says Sarah's too heavy for her lap, and Samuel won't help, and Emma says we should go home. But I don't want to yet because they might bring out more pie, and—" He skidded to a halt, belatedly registering the scene he'd interrupted. His eyes widened as they dropped to our hands, which had instinctively moved apart at his arrival. "Were you holding hands?" he asked, with a child's direct curiosity. "Like sweethearts?" Mr. Morgan began, a note of warning in his voice. "We were watching the sunset," I interjected quickly, rising from the log. "But it's growing dark now, and I think Hannah's right. It's time we headed home." Michael's face fell briefly, but in typical fashion, he bounded ahead toward the blanket, already announcing they were watching the sunset together to his siblings, with enough emphasis to make the nature of his discovery unmistakable. Mr. Morgan sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I'd come to recognize as indicating mild exasperation. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, "and for whatever wild speculation is about to circulate among my children." "Children have active imaginations," I replied lightly, though my racing pulse belied my casual tone. "Shall we collect our brood and head home? They're all exhausted, and tomorrow is Sunday." He nodded, but as we began walking back toward the blanket, he spoke again, his voice pitched for my ears alone. "This conversation isn't finished, Elizabeth, merely postponed." The quiet certainty in his tone sent a pleasant shiver through me, despite the evening's growing chill. Whatever had begun between us at the creek's edge would continue, it seemed. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. As we loaded sleepy children into the wagon for the journey home, my red ribbon prize tucked carefully into my reticule, I found myself contemplating the changing seasons, not just the autumn leaves turning gold around us, but the shifting landscape of my own heart. Like the trees preparing for winter, I had begun to shed old expectations, old certainties, making way for what I couldn't yet say. But as the wagon rumbled homeward beneath a canopy of stars, the Morgan children drowsing around me, and Caleb's solid presence beside me on the driver's bench, I realized that for the first time since arriving in Timber Creek, I was no longer thinking of leaving, but of staying. The thought should have alarmed me far more than it did. November slipped away in a blur of shortening days and increasing cold. The rhythm of life in the Morgan household had settled into comfortable patterns. Schoolwork in the evenings, Sunday services, daily chores, interspersed with moments of laughter and occasional squabbles among the children. My red ribbon from the Harvest Festival hung proudly in the kitchen, a small trophy that the children referenced with continued pride. Mr. Morgan, Caleb, as I'd begun to think of him privately, though I maintained formality in address, had not mentioned our interrupted moment by the creek. Yet something had shifted between us. A heightened awareness, evident in brief glances across the dinner table, the careful courtesy with which he treated me, the way conversation flowed more easily during our occasional moments alone. The promise of merely postponed lingered in the air between us, unacknowledged but undeniably present. The first week of December dawned with leaden skies that had threatened snow for days without delivering. I awoke that Wednesday to an unusual silence. a muffled quality to the world that signaled change even before I opened my eyes. Pulling back the curtain, I gasped at the transformation beyond my window. Overnight, at least 6 inches of pristine white had blanketed Timber Creek, softening every harsh edge and transforming the familiar landscape into a wonderland of white and silver. By the time I dressed and descended to the kitchen, the children had discovered the marvel as well. Michael's face was pressed against the front window, breath fogging the glass as he gazed in wonder at the transformed yard. The twins whispered excitedly by the back door, debating the possibility of convincing their father to allow a snow day rather than sending them to lessons with Pastor Williams. "Miss Foster!" Sarah exclaimed, spotting me. "Snow came. Big snow." "Indeed it did," I agreed, stoking the kitchen fire to chase the morning chill. "Your first big snow, isn't it, Sarah?" She nodded solemnly. "Don't remember before." The realization pierced me unexpectedly. Sarah had been only 3 when her mother died, and last winter she had still been locked in silence. This was, in essence, her first conscious experience of snow, with no memories to draw upon. "Well then," I said, summoning cheerfulness, "we shall have to make this snow especially memorable for you." Mr. Morgan entered from outside, bringing a gust of cold air and a dusting of snowflakes with him. He stamped his boots on the mat, shaking white powder from his coat. 6 inches at least," he announced. "And still coming down. Road to town will be challenging today." "Does that mean no school?" Michael asked hopefully. Mr. Morgan glanced at me, deferring to my judgment in a way that still surprised me occasionally. I considered the heavy snowfall and the twins' pleading expressions. "Perhaps a modified lesson schedule here at home would be more prudent," I suggested. "The children could practice their arithmetic by measuring the snowfall at intervals throughout the day." Mr. Morgan's lips twitched with amusement. "A scientific approach to a snow day. Very resourceful, Miss Foster." The children cheered, even Samuel, though he quickly masked his enthusiasm with affected nonchalance. After a hearty breakfast of oatmeal with dried apples and cinnamon, they bundled into coats, scarves, mittens, and boots to explore the transformed world outside. I watched from the window as they waded through drifts, Michael immediately flopping backward to create a snow angel, while the twins gathered snow for what would surely become ammunition. Samuel, trying to maintain his dignity as the eldest, nevertheless couldn't resist scooping a handful of snow down Michael's collar, resulting in shrieks and laughter. Only Sarah remained inside, watching her siblings with uncertainty from beside me at the window. "Cold," she said with a small shiver, though the house was warm. "It is cold," I agreed, "but also quite wonderful once you're properly dressed for it. Would you like me to help you bundle up to join them?" She hesitated, then nodded, slipping her small hand into mine. I helped her into layers of woolen stockings, her heaviest dress, a coat that had clearly been altered from one of the twins' outgrown garments, mittens tied to a string that threaded through her sleeves, and a knitted cap pulled low over her ears. "There," I said, inspecting my handiwork. "Warm as toast. Shall we venture out together?" Another nod, this one more confident. We stepped onto the porch, where I paused, struck by the brilliance of the snow-reflected light and the crystalline beauty of ice-draped branches. Sarah's small intake of breath beside me suggested she felt the magic too. "Pretty," she whispered. "Very pretty," I agreed. "And look, your brothers and sisters are having such fun." Indeed, the yard had become a battlefield of sorts, with the twins furiously constructing a snow fort while Michael and Samuel pelted them with snowballs. Their cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, their laughter visible as puffs of vapor in the frigid air. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "Stay with me?" "Of course," I assured her, leading her down the porch steps into the virgin snow. It crunched satisfyingly beneath our boots as we made our way toward the others. "Look, Sarah's coming to play," Emma called, waving a mittened hand. "Come help us build a fort, Sarah." The little girl hesitated, then released my hand and waded determinedly toward her sisters, each step a small victory over the deep snow and her own timidity. I watched, heart full, as Hannah showed her how to pack snow into bricks for their fortification. "She's changed so much," Mr. Morgan's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him watching the scene, his expression soft with wonder. 2 months ago, she wouldn't have ventured from the porch, let alone joined in their games. "Children are remarkably resilient," I said. when given safety and encouragement to grow at their own pace. His eyes shifted from Sarah to me, something warm kindling in their blue-gray depths. You've given her that. Given all of them that. Before I could respond, a snowball exploded against his shoulder, sending powder cascading over both of us. Michael's horrified expression suggested the missile had gone astray. He'd likely been aiming for Samuel and now feared his father's reaction. To my delight, Mr. Morgan's response was to calmly brush the snow from his coat, fix Michael with a mock-stern gaze, and declare, "This means war, young man." In one smooth motion, he scooped up a handful of snow, packed it deftly, and sent it sailing through the air to catch Michael squarely in the chest. Shrieks of laughter erupted as battle lines were drawn. Mr. Morgan and the girls defending their partially constructed fort, while Michael and Samuel launched a determined offensive. I found myself drafted to the defender's side, Sarah pressing snowballs into my hands with surprising industry. The mock battle raged for nearly an hour, leaving us all breathless and damp, but glowing with exertion and laughter. Finally, Mr. Morgan called a truce, announcing it was time to warm up before anyone caught a chill. "I need to check on something in the barn," he added, as we herded the children toward the house. "I'll join you shortly." Inside, I supervised the removal of wet outer garments and the hanging of mittens and scarves near the stove to dry. Hot chocolate was prepared and distributed, warming cold hands and pink noses as the children recounted the battle's highlights with enthusiastic embellishment. "Miss Foster," Hannah said suddenly, "could we make decorations for the windows? Mary Peterson says they cut paper snowflakes for their house." "What an excellent idea," I agreed. "We can hang them on the windows to match the snow outside." I gathered paper, scissors, and string, demonstrating how to fold and cut to create delicate six-sided snowflakes. Soon all 5 children were engaged in the project, even Samuel, whose large hands proved surprisingly deft at creating intricate patterns. We were just stringing the first batch to hang in the kitchen windows when Mr. Morgan returned, something large and wooden hoisted on one shoulder. "What's that, Pa?" Michael demanded, abandoning his half-cut snowflake. Mr. Morgan leaned his burden against the wall, a wooden sled large enough to hold at least 3 children, its runners gleaming with fresh metal, its surface polished smooth. "Thought it might be useful on a day like today," he said casually, though the pride in his craftsmanship was evident. "Found the old one in the barn last week and fixed it up a bit." "You made this?" I asked, admiring the workmanship, the curved front, the sturdy construction, the smooth finish that wouldn't snag woolen mittens. "Repaired mostly," he demurred, though I suspected repaired was a modest description for what had clearly been a complete reconstruction. "Seems a shame to have all this perfect sledding snow and no proper way to enjoy it." The children clamored to try it immediately, hot chocolate and snowflakes temporarily forgotten in the excitement of this new adventure. After ensuring everyone was properly dried and rebundled for another excursion, we trooped outside, Mr. Morgan carrying the sled while Michael ran ahead to scout the best hill. The perfect spot proved to be behind the barn where the land sloped gently down toward the creek, now frozen and snow-covered itself. Mr. Morgan positioned the sled at the top, then surprised me by gesturing for me to join the first run. "Oh, I couldn't," I protested automatically. "I haven't been sledding since I was a girl." "All the more reason," he countered with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Sarah needs someone to hold on to for her first time, and I suspect you do too." Put that way, I could hardly refuse. I settled onto the sled with Sarah in my lap, her small body tense with anticipation. Emma squeezed in behind us, leaving Hannah, Michael, and Samuel to await their turns. "Hold tight," Mr. Morgan instructed, positioning himself behind the sled. "Ready?" At our nods, he gave a mighty push, then leapt onto the back of the sled as it began its descent. The sensation of gliding, of cold air rushing past, of snow spraying up beside the runners, was both exhilarating and terrifying. Sarah squealed with delight, her earlier timidity forgotten as we picked up speed. We reached the bottom of the hill in a spray of powder, the sled coming to rest near the creek bank. For a moment, we sat in breathless silence. Then Sarah twisted in my lap to look up at me with shining eyes. "Again?" she demanded, and I laughed, unable to refuse her joy. The afternoon passed in a blur of sledding runs, the children taking turns in various combinations, while Mr. Morgan and I traded places, pushing and riding. By the time the winter sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, we were all pleasantly exhausted, cheeks stinging with cold, but hearts warm with shared enjoyment. That evening, after supper had been cleared away, Mr. Morgan built up the fire in the sitting room to a cheerful blaze. The children gathered around it on the rug, Michael and Sarah with a checkerboard between them, the twins with their knitting, Samuel whittling a small figure from a piece of pine. I settled into the rocking chair with a book I'd discovered on a high shelf in Mr. Morgan's sparsely populated bookcase. A copy of Little Women that had clearly belonged to his late wife, her name inscribed in a delicate hand on the flyleaf. "Would you read aloud, Miss Foster?" Emma asked, looking up from her knitting. "We never finished the story Mother started." A glance at Mr. Morgan found him nodding encouragement from his own chair, opposite mine. "Sarah, my wife, was reading that to them before she fell ill," he explained quietly. "They've never heard the ending." The poignancy of the moment, of being invited to continue something his beloved wife had begun, was not lost on me. I opened the book, finding a faded ribbon marking a place about 1/3 through. "Shall I start from this ribbon?" I asked gently. Small nods answered me, even from Samuel, who had paused in his whittling. I began to read, the familiar words of Louisa May Alcott flowing into the warm, fire-lit room as outside, snow continued to fall in gentle persistence. The children were quickly absorbed in the March sisters' adventures, even Michael setting aside his natural restlessness to listen. Sarah abandoned her checkers to curl against my skirts, her small head resting against my knee as she gazed into the fire, perhaps envisioning the scenes I described. As the chapter progressed, I became aware of Mr. Morgan's gaze. Glancing up briefly between paragraphs, I found him watching me rather than the fire, his expression one of quiet contemplation. When our eyes met, he didn't look away, but offered a small smile that sent warmth curling through my chest, despite the winter night beyond our windows. I continued reading, but part of my awareness remained fixed on his presence across from me, on the tableau we created together, a family circle gathered before the fire, sharing a story on a snowy evening, the outside world held at bay by the walls that sheltered us, and the bonds forming between us. It was, I realized with a start, precisely the sort of domestic scene I had imagined when agreeing to marry Harold Miller. This sense of belonging, of creating a haven against the world's harshness. Yet here I found it not with the man I had traveled so far to marry, but with a widowed blacksmith and his 5 children who had begun their acquaintance with me through missing shoes and spilled milk. The irony was not lost on me, nor was the danger inherent in allowing myself to imagine this arrangement as permanent. Yet as Sarah's breathing deepened into sleep against my knee, and Mr. Morgan's gaze remained steady and warm across the hearth, I found it increasingly difficult to hold fast to the certainty that my future lay elsewhere. "Just a bit more silver thread here, Michael," I guided, watching as his tongue protruded slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration. "Careful not to pull too tight." "It's hard to make tiny stitches," he complained, though he followed my instruction with surprising patience. "Do you think Pa will like it?" "I think he'll treasure it," I assured him, admiring the bookmark taking shape beneath his inexpert but earnest needlework. Each child was creating a Christmas gift for their father. Small tokens, crafted in secret during the afternoon hours when he worked at his forge. Samuel had whittled a pipe rack with surprising skill. The twins had knitted a muffler in alternating stripes of navy and gray, and Michael was embroidering a bookmark with a simple anvil design I'd sketched for him. Even Sarah contributed, carefully stringing wooden beads I'd painted to create a watch chain. My own secret project was more ambitious, individual gifts for each child, sewn during the late evening hours after the household had gone to sleep. For Samuel, a new journal bound in leather scraps from the forge, each page carefully ruled for his increasingly impressive draftsmanship. For the twins, matching reticules sewn from dress remnants and embellished with tiny embroidered flowers. For Michael, a soft cloth ball sewn in sections and stuffed with wool, perfect for indoor play during the long winter evenings. And for Sarah, a companion doll for the one-armed friend she had gifted me, complete with a tiny trunk containing miniature clothes to dress her in. These treasures I kept hidden in the bottom of my wardrobe, working on them by lamplight with fingers sometimes numb with fatigue, but heart full of anticipation for the children's reactions on Christmas morning. "Miss Foster," Hannah called from the kitchen where she and Emma were attempting a batch of sugar cookies, "is the dough supposed to be this sticky?" I carefully covered Michael's project with a cloth before investigating, finding the twins dusted with flour and regarding a bowl of decidedly over-moist dough with matching expressions of dismay. "Perhaps a bit more flour," I suggested, rolling up my sleeves to demonstrate. "Making is as much art as science. You need to feel when the consistency is right." As I guided them through salvaging their dough, snow began falling again outside the kitchen window. Fat, lazy flakes that promised another significant accumulation by morning. December had brought storm after storm, transforming Timber Creek into a glistening, white-draped version of itself that still took my breath away each morning. "Will we go to town tomorrow for supplies?" Emma asked, carefully cutting a star-shaped cookie. "We need ribbon to finish Pa's muffler." "If the snow isn't too deep," I replied. "Your father mentioned needing supplies for the forge as well, so I imagine we'll make the attempt." The prospect of a trip to town with Mr. Morgan sent a small thrill through me that I quickly suppressed. Since our sledding adventure and the evening by the fire, a new ease had developed between us. Small touches that might have been accidental but felt deliberate. Conversations that lingered beyond practical necessities. Glances that held meaning I wasn't yet brave enough to interpret with certainty. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the snow having stopped sometime in the night, after adding another 3 inches to the already substantial blanket covering the landscape. Mr. Morgan harnessed the horses to the wagon, replacing the wheels with runners that would glide over the snow instead of bogging down in it. "The older children have lessons with Pastor Williams," he reminded me as we prepared to depart. "We can collect them afterward if our errands run long." This left just Sarah to accompany us, bundled so thoroughly in woolen layers that only her bright eyes and the tip of her nose remained visible between cap and scarf. I saddled her between us on the seat, tucking a heavy quilt around our legs against the cold. The journey to town took twice as long as usual, the horses picking their way carefully along the snow-packed road. My breath clouded before me, and I was grateful for the warmth of Sarah on one side and Mr. Morgan on the other, his solid presence a buffer against the biting wind. Timber Creek had been transformed by winter, its familiar buildings now adorned with icicles that sparkled in the morning sunlight. The general store's windows gleamed with festive displays, ribbons, candies, and small toys arranged to tempt holiday shoppers. Mrs. Wilson had adorned her counter with evergreen boughs and red berries, filling the store with their crisp, resinous scent. "Elizabeth! Sarah!" she exclaimed as we entered, the bell above the door announcing our arrival. "And Caleb, too. What a lovely sight you 3 make, all rosy-cheeked from the cold." I felt heat rise to my face at her knowing tone. Mrs. Wilson had taken to using my given name shortly after the Harvest Festival, declaring that we were friends now, not merely shopkeeper and customer. Her use of Mr. Morgan's Christian name in the same breath created an implication of familial connection that both flustered and secretly pleased me. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," I replied, unwinding my scarf. "We've come for supplies before the next storm arrives." "Wise decision," she agreed. "The mail carrier says there's another big one brewing, likely to hit by week's end." Mr. Morgan set Sarah down, instructing her to stay within sight as he consulted a list of items needed for the forge. I produced my own list: flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples, along with specific requests from the children for their Christmas preparations. As I moved through the store gathering items, I became aware of Mr. Morgan's presence nearby, our paths crossing repeatedly as we collected our respective supplies. Once, reaching for a tin of baking powder on a high shelf, I felt his hand cover mine as he easily retrieved it for me, our bodies close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the layers of winter clothing between us. "Thank you," I murmured, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his eyes. "My pleasure," he replied, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "I find myself looking for excuses to be helpful these days." The simple admission sent a flutter through me that had nothing to do with the store's temperature. Before I could formulate a response, Sarah appeared, tugging at my skirt. "Pretty," she announced, pointing to a display of ribbon candy in glass jars near the counter. Very pretty, I agreed, grateful for the distraction. Perhaps we might select a small treat for everyone as an early Christmas surprise. Her solemn nod set us on a new task, choosing candies that would please each child. Mr. Morgan joined us, offering suggestions based on his knowledge of their preferences. Our shoulders brushed as we deliberated between peppermint sticks and maple sugar candies, the contact brief but somehow significant in its casualness. Mrs. Wilson watched our interactions from behind the counter, her expression knowing as she wrapped our purchases in brown paper. When Mr. Morgan stepped outside to secure the larger items to the sled, she leaned toward me confidentially. "You've found your place after all, haven't you, Elizabeth?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Not quite as you expected when you first arrived, but perhaps better in the end?" I busied myself adjusting Sarah's cap, avoiding the directness of Mrs. Wilson's gaze. "The Morgan family has been very kind to me," I replied neutrally. "I've grown quite fond of the children." "Just the children?" she pressed, her eyes twinkling. Heat rose to my cheeks despite my best efforts to appear composed. "Mrs. Wilson, You needn't say anything, dear," she interrupted, patting my gloved hand. "Some things speak for themselves." She glanced meaningly through the window where Mr. Morgan could be seen loading supplies. "He smiles now, you know. Before you came, I don't think I'd seen a genuine smile cross that man's face in 2 years." The observation lodged somewhere beneath my ribs, a warm pressure both pleasant and painful. I had noticed the change in him myself, the gradual softening of the stern demeanor he had presented when I first arrived, the increasing frequency of laughter in the household, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he watched his children at play. Had I contributed to that transformation? The possibility both thrilled and terrified me, for it carried implications I wasn't yet prepared to fully examine. "We should be getting back," I said, gathering the remaining parcels. "The children will be finishing their lessons soon." Mrs. Wilson smiled, clearly recognizing my evasion but kind enough not to press further. "Of course, dear. Give those little ones my best and tell them Mrs. Wilson has set aside some special candy canes for them to pick up after Sunday services." Sarah's eyes lit up at this news, and she slipped her mittened hand into mine as we left the store. Outside, Mr. Morgan waited with the sled ready, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold. "Everything squared away?" he asked as he helped us aboard, his hand lingering at my waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Yes, thank you," I replied, settling Sarah between us once more. "Mrs. Wilson sends her regards and promises candy canes for the children on Sunday." As we began the journey home, snow started falling again. Not the heavy flakes of last night's storm, but delicate crystalline motes that caught the sunlight like diamond dust. Sarah tilted her face upward, trying to catch them on her tongue, her delight infectious. Mr. Morgan's gaze met mine over her head, his expression reflective. "Christmas was always Sarah's favorite season," he said quietly, and I knew he spoke of his wife, not his daughter. She loved the preparations almost more than the day itself. It was the most direct reference he had made to her in my presence, and I recognized the significance of the confidence. "She must have made it very special for the children," I said carefully. He nodded, his eyes returning to the snowy road ahead. "She did. Last year was difficult. Our first without her." His hands tightened on the reins briefly. "This year feels different." The simple statement hung in the air between us, laden with meaning neither of us was quite ready to articulate. I reached to adjust the quilt over Sarah's lap, my gloved hand briefly brushing his. "I hope," I said softly, "that this Christmas brings joy back to your household." "It already has," he replied, his gaze steady on the horizon. "You already have." We continued in companionable silence after that. The only sounds, the jingling of harness bells and the soft shush of runners over snow. Yet in that silence, something profound had been acknowledged. A shifting of relationship, a recognition of possibility, a door opening to a future neither of us had anticipated, when fate and Harold Miller's betrayal first brought me to the Morgan household. As we collected the older children from their lessons and made our way home through the gently falling snow, I found myself no longer counting the days of my employment or calculating my savings toward an eventual return east. Instead, I was counting the days until Christmas, anticipating the children's joy at their gifts, imagining the glow of firelight on beloved faces as we celebrated together. The realization should have alarmed me, this gradual, unplanned reorientation of my heart's compass. Yet as Sarah dozed against my side and Mr. Morgan's steady hands guided us safely homeward, I found myself embracing the uncertainty with unexpected serenity. Whatever the future held, this moment, this family, had become precious to me in ways I had never anticipated. And that, perhaps, was the most unexpected gift of all. Chapter 5. The Return of Harold. The frigid January wind howled against the window panes as I kneaded bread dough with more vigor than necessary. The new year had arrived with bitter cold and knee-deep snow. But inside the Morgan home, the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and the scent of rising yeast filled the kitchen. I hummed softly, working the dough with practiced hands that had grown stronger during my months in Timber Creek. "Miss Foster! Miss Foster!" Michael burst through the door, his cheeks flaming red from the cold, snowflakes melting on his woolen cap. "Mrs. Wilson sent me with a message, says it's important." I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron. "Slow down, Michael. Catch your breath first." The 8-year-old panted, eyes wide. "It's about that man, the one who didn't marry you. His wife died having their baby." My fingers stilled on the apron. "Harold Miller's wife? Are you certain?" Michael nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Wilson said she passed 3 days ago. The doctor couldn't save her, but the baby lived. It's a boy." I sank into a kitchen chair, a strange hollowness expanding in my chest. 6 months ago, the news might have brought me vindictive satisfaction, proof that God punished Harold for his betrayal. Now I felt only profound sorrow for a young woman I'd barely known, whose life had been cut so tragically short. "The poor infant," I whispered, "to come into this world at such cost." "Are you sad, Miss Foster?" Sarah's small voice came from the doorway where she stood clutching her rag doll. Since breaking her silence 2 months prior, her vocabulary had grown rapidly, though she still spoke primarily to me. I beckoned her closer. "Yes, sweetheart, it's a very sad thing when a mother dies." Sarah climbed onto my lap, her tiny hand patting my cheek with innocent compassion. "Like my mama died?" "Yes, like your mama." I pressed a kiss to her forehead, inhaling the sweet scent of her hair. "But you have your pa and your brothers and sisters." "This little baby only has his father now." Emma and Hannah appeared in the doorway, their twin expressions solemn. I hadn't realized they'd returned from delivering mended clothes to neighbors. "Are you going to go take care of the baby?" Emma asked, anxiety creasing her young brow. Hannah clutched her sister's hand. "You won't leave us, will you?" The question pierced my heart. "Why would you think such a thing?" "Because he was supposed to be your husband," Hannah replied. "And now he needs someone to mind his baby." I shook my head firmly. "Harold Miller made his choice months ago. I have no obligation to him or his child." I reached for their hands. "My place is here with you, so long as your father wishes me to stay." Their relief was palpable, but as I returned to my bread making, doubt crept in with the chill from the windows. In truth, I had built a life here I never expected, one filled with the love of these children and the quiet satisfaction of bringing order to chaos. Yet, in the eyes of the town, I remained the jilted bride, an object of pity reduced to keeping house for the widowed blacksmith. Would Harold's tragedy change how people viewed our respective situations? Later that evening, after the children were abed, I heard Caleb in the smithy long after his usual hours. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil carried through the still night air, each strike sounding unnaturally harsh and forceful. When he finally came inside, his expression was shuttered, jaw tight beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "I heard about Mrs. Miller," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee despite the late hour. "A terrible business." "Yes," I agreed, setting aside my mending. "I can't help thinking of the infant." Caleb stared into his cup. "A boy needs his mother." "Any child does." I studied his profile in the lamplight. "You managed admirably after your wife passed." "Did I?" His laugh held no humor. 5 wild children and a house in shambles until you arrived? I'd hardly call that admirable. I reached across the table, almost touching his hand before drawing back. You kept them fed, clothed, and loved. That counts for more than tidy rooms. His gaze met mine, something unreadable in those gray depths. You've been a godsend to this family, Elizabeth. The use of my Christian name, rare from his lips, sent warmth coursing through me. They've become dear to me as well. He looked away first. Miller will be needing help with the infant. I suppose he will. Be a fool not to come calling on you again. Caleb's voice had gone flat. You being a teacher and good with children, having history between you. My heart stuttered. I have no interest in... It would be a proper position for you. A wife instead of a housekeeper. He stood abruptly. I should check on Samuel. The boy's been restless lately. He left me sitting alone, confusion and hurt warring within my breast. In the months I'd lived under Caleb Morgan's roof, I'd come to admire his strength, his devotion to his children, his quiet integrity. More than admire, though I scarcely dared admit it even to myself, yet tonight he seemed almost eager to be rid of me, pushing me toward Harold Miller of all people. I blew out the lamp and made my way to my small room, peering in on the children as I passed. All were sleeping soundly, even Samuel, despite his father's concern. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, Sarah's face looked angelic, one arm wrapped around her doll. I remembered her first words to me, how they'd broken open something in my heart I thought permanently sealed after Harold's betrayal. No, I resolved as I prepared for bed. Whatever Caleb's feelings, I would not abandon these children for Harold Miller. The man had wounded me deeply once. I was neither fool enough nor saint enough to give him a second chance. 3 days later, I was hanging laundry in the bitter cold, my fingers numbed despite woolen gloves, when the sound of an approaching wagon drew my attention. The visitor's identity became clear as the conveyance drew nearer, and my stomach knotted with dread. Harold Miller looking gaunt and grim, his hat clutched in gloved hands as he slowed his team before the Morgan home. I straightened my spine and continued pinning a sheet to the line, refusing to acknowledge him until propriety demanded it. The frozen fabric crackled as I smoothed it, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Elizabeth," he called, climbing down from the wagon. "Miss Foster, might I have a word?" I turned slowly, keeping my expression neutral. "Mr. Miller, my condolences on your loss." He removed his hat, revealing hair more disheveled than I remembered. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and grief had carved lines around his mouth that hadn't existed 6 months ago. "Thank you," he said, twisting the brim of his hat. "It's been difficult." "I imagine so." I pinned the last corner of the sheet. "How is your son faring?" "Not well. He cries constantly. Mrs. Wilson has been kind enough to find women to help, but..." He looked down at his boots. "I was hoping we might speak privately." At that moment, Caleb emerged from his smithy, leather apron still tied around his waist, a thunderous expression on his normally calm face. He crossed the yard with long strides, positioning himself slightly between Harold and me. "Miller," he said curtly, "what brings you here?" Harold straightened. "I'd like to speak with Miss Foster if you've no objection." "That's for her to decide." Caleb's tone made it clear he had plenty of objections. I touched Caleb's arm lightly. "It's all right." To Harold, I added, "We can speak in the parlor, Mr. Miller." Caleb's jaw worked silently before he nodded once. "I'll be right outside if you need anything, Elizabeth." The protective intent behind his words warmed me despite the January chill. I led Harold into the house, removing my gloves and shawl. The parlor was modest but tidy, with handmade quilts brightening the simple furniture. Through the window, I could see Caleb standing rigidly in the yard, staring at the house as though he could see through its walls. "Please, sit," I offered, though I remained standing myself. Harold perched on the edge of the sofa, still fidgeting with his hat. "You've made a home here," he observed, glancing around. "I've made order in someone else's home," I corrected. "There's a difference." What I didn't say was that this humble dwelling felt more like home than the grand house Harold had described in his letters ever could have. "Elizabeth, He broke off, swallowing hard. "I've come to ask your forgiveness." I clasped my hands before me. "You have it, Mr. Miller. I forgave you months ago." His eyes widened in surprise. "You did?" My faith requires it, I said simply, though forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. From the corner of my eye, I caught a slight movement behind the curtains. The twins, no doubt, eavesdropping despite my repeated lessons on the impropriety of such behavior. I suppressed a sigh. You're right, of course. Harold set his hat aside and leaned forward. Elizabeth, I made a terrible mistake. Marrying Constance, it wasn't what I truly wanted. I stiffened. Mr. Miller, please hear me out. His voice took on an urgent quality. Her father pressured me, offered financial backing for my farm expansion. I was weak, and I've paid dearly for that weakness. Your wife paid more, I said quietly. She lost her life. He flinched. Yes. And now my son has no mother. He stood suddenly, moving closer. Elizabeth, the arrangements we made still stand in my mind. I still have the land, the house, everything I promised you in my letters. I stepped back, maintaining distance between us. Mr. Miller, if you're suggesting we could still marry, he pressed on, you could be mother to my son. We had an agreement. An agreement you broke, I reminded him, anger finally bleeding into my voice. You made vows to another woman while I was traveling across the country to honor my commitment to you. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. I glanced toward the sound and caught a glimpse of small feet disappearing behind the sideboard. Not just the twins, then. All the children were listening. I know I hurt you, Harold acknowledged, but God has seen fit to give us a second chance. My son needs a mother, Elizabeth. And you, he gestured vaguely at the modest surroundings. Surely you'd prefer being a farmer's wife to a blacksmith's housekeeper. Before I could respond, the front door opened and Caleb filled the doorframe, his expression dark as a gathering storm. I believe you've said your piece, Miller, he said, voice dangerously quiet. Harold turned, bristling at the interruption. This is a private conversation between Miss Foster and myself. In my home, Caleb countered, where my children can hear every word. He stepped fully into the room. If Miss Foster wishes to continue this discussion, she may do so at a more appropriate location. I could see the stubborn set of his jaw, the tension in his broad shoulders. Whatever feelings had made him so withdrawn after news of Harold's wife had shifted into something fiercer, more possessive. Harold looked between us, understanding dawning in his eyes. I see. Perhaps you've found more than employment here, Elizabeth. Miller, I said firmly, I appreciate your call and again offer my condolences, but I need time to consider your proposal. Hope flickered across his face. Then you'll think on it? She said she needs time, Caleb interjected. Now, I think it's best you take your leave. For a moment, I thought Harold might argue, but he merely retrieved his hat, nodding stiffly. I'll call again in a few days, Elizabeth. He departed without another word to Caleb. When the door closed behind him, I became acutely aware of the silence in the house. A silence that spoke volumes about the small ears listening from various hiding places. You can all come out now, I called, and slowly, sheepishly, 5 children emerged from behind furniture and doorways. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, leaving sooty streaks. I apologize for interfering, he said gruffly. It wasn't my place. It's your home, I reminded him. And I appreciate your concern. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away. Will you go with him? Sarah asked in a small voice, clutching at my skirts. Will you be the baby's mama instead of ours? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning that went beyond a child's simple understanding. I knelt to her level, aware of the others watching just as intently. Samuel trying to appear indifferent, the twins clinging to each other, Michael gnawing his lower lip. I haven't decided anything, I told them honestly. But whatever happens, you will always be dear to me. I glanced up to find Caleb watching us, his expression unreadable once more. Children, Miss Foster needs privacy to consider her options, he said, his voice oddly formal. Emma Hannah, help your sisters set the table for dinner. As the children reluctantly dispersed, Caleb lingered. Elizabeth. He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. Miller can offer you a position of respect in the community, a real home of your own. Is that what you think I want? I asked, searching his face for any hint of his true feelings. His shoulders slumped slightly. I think you deserve better than being a hired housekeeper, especially when—" He trailed off, jaw clenching. "When what?" "When the town still sees you as the woman he jilted." Caleb looked away. "This might be your chance to change that story." With that, he returned to his smithy, leaving me standing alone in the parlor, wondering if he truly wished me to accept Harold's offer or if he was trying, in his own stubborn way, to do what he thought best for me, even at the cost of his own happiness. Through the window, I watched him stride across the yard, his figure dark against the snow. The sound of his hammer soon rang out, each strike seeming to echo the confusion in my own heart. The following afternoon, Harold returned as promised. This time, I met him at Mrs. Wilson's store, away from the curious ears of the Morgan children and Caleb's protective gaze. The general store was quiet, with only an elderly gentleman examining tools in the far corner. Mrs. Wilson, after a meaningful glance in my direction, busied herself with inventory in the back room, granting us a measure of privacy. Harold removed his hat as I approached, revealing hair that had been neatly combed, a stark contrast to yesterday's disheveled appearance. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me, Elizabeth," he said, his voice carrying the weight of sleepless nights. I folded my hands before me, the wool of my gloves scratching against my palms. "I'm listening, Mr. Miller." "Harold, please." He gestured toward 2 chairs near the pot-bellied stove. "Might we sit?" I nodded, arranging my skirts as I took my seat. The heat from the stove seeped through my layers of clothing, but did little to warm the chill that had settled within me since his unexpected appearance at the Morgan home. "First, I must apologize, again," he began, leaning forward with elbows on his knees. "What I did to you was unforgivable. I made promises I failed to keep." "You've already apologized," I reminded him, "and, as I said, you have my forgiveness." Harold shook his head, his eyes earnest. "Forgiveness is one thing, understanding is another." He sighed heavily, twisting his hat brim. "I want you to know why I acted as I did." The scent of coffee brewing mingled with the sharp tang of pickles and leather goods. Outside, a wagon rumbled past, momentarily drowning out the soft tick of the clock on the wall. "I never intended to betray you," Harold continued. "When Constance's father approached me with his offer, I was weak. The drought had damaged my crops and my debts were mounting. He offered to pay them all, plus finance the new barn and additional acreage I'd written to you about. So you married for money," I said softly, no judgment in my tone. His face flushed with shame. "Yes, God forgive me, I did." He looked down at his hands. "I told myself you would understand once I explained, that you might even be relieved not to marry a failing farmer. I thought of the months I'd spent preparing for our marriage, sewing linens, resigning my teaching position, selling most of my possessions to afford the journey west." "You might have explained before I traveled halfway across the country." "I know." His voice cracked. "By the time I realized my mistake, you were already en route. I was too much of a coward to telegraph the truth." A bitter smile tugged at my lips. "And so I arrived to find you already wed." "It was wrong. All of it." Harold met my eyes directly. "I married a woman I didn't love, out of greed and fear. And now she's gone, leaving behind an innocent child who suffers for his father's sins." I looked away, unable to bear the naked pain in his expression. Through the store window, I could see the smithy at the edge of town, smoke rising from its chimney. Caleb would be at his forge now, hammer ringing against anvil, strong arms shaping metal to his will. The image brought an ache to my chest that confused me. "Elizabeth," Harold's voice pulled my attention back. "I know I have no right to ask, but my son needs a mother. He cries through the night, refusing to take milk from the wet nurse. The house is in disarray. I'm desperate." "There are many capable women in town who could assist you," I said carefully. "I don't want just any woman." He reached for my hand, and I allowed the brief contact. "I want the woman I should have married in the first place. The woman whose forgiveness I don't deserve but desperately need." His palm was smooth against mine, the hands of a man who directed labor rather than performed it himself. So different from Caleb's calloused fingers, roughened by years of working with fire and iron. "The agreement we made still stands," Harold continued earnestly. "The house is built as I described in my letters, 4 bedrooms, a proper parlor. The land is good, and with spring planting will prosper. His grip tightened. You could teach our children, tend a garden of your own, be a respected farmer's wife instead of a servant. I withdrew my hand, stung by his choice of words. I am not a servant, Mr. Miller. I'm a housekeeper who has become part of a family. Of course, he said quickly. I meant no offense, only that you deserve better. A husband, children of your own. His voice softened. My son needs you, Elizabeth, and I believe I could make you happy given a second chance. A chill swept through me despite the stove's heat. 5 beloved faces flashed through my mind. Samuel's reluctant smile when I praised his arithmetic, the twins' giggles as they helped me knead dough, Michael's exuberance when showing me a frog he'd caught, Sarah's solemn expression as she practiced her letters, and Caleb, the quiet strength in his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking. I need time, I said finally. This isn't a decision to be made lightly. Relief washed over Harold's features. Of course. Take all the time you need. He stood, donning his hat. I'll return in 3 days for your answer. After he left, I remained seated, staring into the glowing heart of the stove. Mrs. Wilson emerged from the back room, her steps deliberate as she approached. That man has some nerve, she said, arranging jars on a nearby shelf. Breaking your heart once wasn't enough for him? I sighed. He's suffering, Mrs. Wilson, and his child is innocent in all this. She crossed her arms. And what of the Morgan children? They've grown mighty attached to you. She peered at me over her spectacles. Not to mention their father. Heat rushed to my cheeks. Mr. Morgan values my services as a housekeeper, nothing more. Mrs. Wilson's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise, but she merely patted my arm. Just remember, child, sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones wrapped in the fanciest packages. I departed with her words echoing in my mind, torn between duty and desire. As a Christian woman, wasn't I obligated to help a motherless infant? Yet the thought of leaving the Morgans created a physical ache within me. I'd come to love those children as my own, and Caleb... The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. Somewhere along the way, between taming his wild brood and creating order from chaos, I'd fallen in love with Caleb Morgan. The quiet blacksmith with gentle hands and fierce protective instincts had claimed my heart without either of us noticing. But did he return my feelings, or was I merely a convenient solution to his domestic troubles? Snow began to fall as I made my way back to the Morgan home, fat flakes catching on my eyelashes and melting on my cheeks like tears. The Morgan household was unusually quiet that evening. The children, sensing the tension that had settled over the home since Harold's visit, were subdued during supper. Even Michael managed to eat without spilling his milk, a minor miracle in itself. After the meal, they complied with unusual promptness when I sent them to prepare for bed. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes by lamplight, when I heard Caleb's heavy tread behind me. The scent of smoke and iron clung to him, familiar and comforting. The children missed you today, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Sarah asked 12 times when you'd return. I kept my eyes on the soapy water. I had errands to run. At Mrs. Wilson's store? With Harold Miller? My hand stilled on a plate. You knew? It's a small town, Elizabeth. His voice held no accusation, only a weary resignation. Word travels. I turned to face him, drying my hands on my apron. He wished to speak with me privately. Caleb nodded, his expression carefully neutral. In the lamplight, shadows accentuated the strong line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows that had deepened in recent days. I heard enough yesterday to understand what he wants. He set down his cup with deliberate care. He's offering marriage. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes? Caleb moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered yard, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkness. Will you accept? The directness of his question caught me off guard. I searched for words that wouldn't reveal the turmoil in my heart. I haven't decided. There's much to consider, such as... His voice was oddly flat. His son needs a mother, I said softly. And Harold is... repentant. Is that enough reason to bind yourself to a man who betrayed you once already? Caleb turned, his eyes searching mine. Hope fluttered in my chest. Was this jealousy? Did he care enough to fight for me to stay? What would you have me do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb was silent for a long moment, the ticking of the mantel clock marking seconds that stretched between us like years. When he finally spoke, his words fell like stones into still water. I think you should accept his proposal. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. What? Miller can give you what I cannot. Caleb's face was a mask of stoic resolve. A proper marriage, a home of your own, status in the community beyond that of a hired housekeeper. Each word was a knife twisting in my heart. I've never complained about my position here. You shouldn't have to. His fingers gripped the back of a chair, knuckles whitening. You're an educated woman, Elizabeth, a teacher. You deserve more than cooking and cleaning for a blacksmith and his unruly children. The children are hardly unruly anymore, I protested, desperate to steer the conversation away from the crushing weight of his indifference. And I found great satisfaction in doing your Christian duty, he finished for me, just as you'd be doing by mothering Miller's infant. Tears threatened, but I blinked them back. Is that all you think this has been? Duty? Caleb's expression softened momentarily before hardening again into resolve. I think you came here because you had nowhere else to go. Now you have a choice, a chance for the life you came west seeking in the first place. The life I sought was based on falsehoods, I reminded him. Harold's letters painted a picture that never existed. Perhaps. Caleb moved toward the door as if he couldn't bear to remain in my presence. But he can offer you legitimacy I cannot. You'll be Mrs. Miller, not Miss Foster, who tends the blacksmith's brats. Don't call them that, I said sharply. They're wonderful children who've grown so much these past months. Thanks to you. His voice gentled. Which is why you'd make an excellent mother to Miller's son. I stared at him, unable to comprehend how he could so calmly advocate for my departure. Had I misread every glance, every moment of connection between us? Was I nothing more to him than a convenient solution to his domestic troubles? I see, I managed finally, my throat tight with unshed tears. You wish me to go. Something flashed in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, but it disappeared so quickly I might have imagined it. I wish for your happiness, Elizabeth. You'll find it as a wife, not a housekeeper. Without another word, he departed, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that belied the storm raging in my breast. Through the window, I watched him cross the yard to his smithy, his head bowed against the falling snow. I pressed my hand to my mouth, stifling a sob. All this time, I'd harbored growing feelings for a man who saw me as nothing more than hired help. Caleb's apparent indifference to my leaving cut deeper than Harold's betrayal ever had. Miss Foster? Sarah's small voice came from the doorway. She stood in her nightgown, clutching her rag doll. Are you crying? I quickly wiped my eyes, forcing a smile. No, sweetheart, just tired. You should be in bed. She padded across the floor in bare feet and wrapped her arms around my waist. Paul looked sad when he went out. I stroked her hair, unable to explain the complexities of adult hearts to a child who had already experienced too much loss. Sometimes grown-ups have difficult decisions to make. About Mr. Miller? Her gray eyes, so like her father's, searched mine with uncanny perception. Yes, I admitted. About Mr. Miller. Will you be his new wife? Her lower lip trembled. Will you leave us? I knelt to her level, cupping her face in my hands. No matter what happens, I will always care for you, Sarah, for all of you. But as I tucked her back into bed, joining the twins who pretended to sleep, though their tense postures betrayed their wakefulness, my heart hardened with resolve. If Caleb Morgan could so easily encourage me to leave, then perhaps I should. Pride demanded I not stay where I wasn't truly wanted. Harold's second chance might be my own as well. A chance to build the life I'd journeyed west to find, to be a proper wife instead of a woman dependent on a man who viewed me as a convenient solution to his problems. As I prepared for bed that night, I removed paper and pen from my trunk. determined to write an acceptance to Harold's proposal. Yet as the pen hovered over the blank page, I found myself unable to form the words that would sever my connection to this home and the people who had claimed my heart. Outside my window, light still blazed from the smithy. The rhythmic sound of Caleb's hammer carried through the night, each strike seeming to echo the painful cadence of my thoughts. He wants you to go. He wants you to go. Chapter 6. Separate Ways. 3 days passed like a fever dream. The decision that had seemed so clear in the wake of Caleb's indifference grew murkier with each passing hour, each shared meal, each bedtime story. Yet Harold would arrive tomorrow for my answer, and I could delay no longer. The children deserved to hear the truth from my lips, rather than through town gossip. I chose Sunday afternoon for my announcement. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the modest parlor where we had gathered after church services. Outside, a fresh blanket of snow glittered beneath a rare appearance of winter sunshine, deceptively cheerful for such a somber occasion. "Children," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "I've asked you to join me because I have important news to share." 5 faces turned toward me with varying degrees of apprehension. They already suspected, of course. Children possess an uncanny instinct for impending change. The twins huddled together on the small settee, their identical blue dresses making them appear even more like reflections of one another. Michael sat cross-legged on the rug before the fire, fidgeting with a wooden top he'd received at Christmas. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, affecting casual disinterest, though his tense posture betrayed him. And little Sarah, perched on my lap, clutched her rag doll with white-knuckled fingers. Caleb stood by the window, his broad back to the room, staring out at the winter landscape as though memorizing every detail. I stroked Sarah's soft hair, gathering courage. "Mr. Miller has asked me to become his wife and mother to his infant son." The silence that followed felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Samuel's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek so like his father's. The twins exchanged panicked glances, their eyes widening in perfect synchrony. "After careful consideration," I continued, each word feeling like a betrayal, "I've decided to accept his proposal." Emma was the first to break. "No," she cried, tears spilling down her freckled cheeks. "You can't leave us." Hannah joined her sister's protest, their voices overlapping in desperate pleas. "We need you more than his baby does. We were here first." "You promised to teach me to make sugar cookies," Emma sobbed. "You promised." "I'll still teach you," I assured her, my own eyes burning. "I'll visit often, and we'll continue our lessons." "Liar!" Samuel's outburst sliced through the room like a whip crack, his young face contorted with fury and hurt. "You're just like everyone else, making promises you don't intend to keep." Before I could respond, he stormed from the room, the front door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Caleb made no move to follow, though his shoulders visibly tensed at his eldest son's departure. "Samuel doesn't mean it, Miss Foster," Hannah sniffled, ever the peacemaker. "He's just sad." Michael, who had remained unnaturally still throughout my announcement, suddenly launched to his feet, knocking over a side table. The lamp atop it tottered precariously before Caleb's hand shot out to steady it. "I hate Mr. Miller," Michael shouted, his small face flushed crimson. "I hate him and his stupid baby." "Michael," I admonished gently, "we don't speak of others that way." "I don't care." He kicked the fallen table. "He's stealing you, and I hate him." Before I could rise, Michael flung himself on the floor, pounding his fists against the braided rug, in a display of temper I hadn't witnessed since my earliest days in the Morgan household. The progress we'd made together seemed to unravel before my eyes. Through it all, Sarah remained motionless in my lap, her small body growing increasingly rigid. When I looked down at her face, my heart nearly shattered. Her gray eyes, so like her father's, had gone vacant, her expression eerily blank. I recognized that emptiness. It was the same retreat into silence she'd employed after her mother's death. "Sarah, sweetheart," I whispered, turning her to face me. "Will you speak to me?" She stared through me as though I were already gone, clutching her doll against her chest like a shield. I looked helplessly toward Caleb, silently pleading for assistance, but he remained by the window, his profile carved from stone. Children, please understand, I tried again, raising my voice above Michael's continued wails and the twins' sobbing. This isn't goodbye forever. I'll only be at the Miller farm just a short ride away. It's not the same, Emma cried. You won't be here when we wake up scared, or when Michael has nightmares, or when Sarah needs help with her letters. I know it will be different, I acknowledged, blinking back tears, but my affection for you won't change. I promised your father I would help until he found a suitable replacement, and now? Is that all we were to you? Hannah's voice cracked. A job? The accusation stung like a physical blow. No, you've become much more than children. Caleb's quiet command cut through the chaos. That's enough. Miss Foster has made her decision. We will respect it. He finally turned from the window, his face a careful mask. Emma, Hannah, please take Sarah upstairs. Michael, stop that caterwauling this instant. To my surprise, they obeyed without argument, though their tear-streaked faces haunted me as they trudged from the room. Sarah slid from my lap without a backward glance, following her sisters with mechanical steps. Only Michael lingered, his tantrum subsiding to hiccuping sobs. Will you at least come for my birthday? He asked, fingers working the frayed edge of his shirt. It's only 3 weeks away. I crossed to him, kneeling to meet his eyes. I wouldn't miss it for all the gold in California. He nodded once before darting from the room, leaving Caleb and me alone in a silence that felt heavier than all the children's outbursts combined. I'm sorry, I said finally. I'd hoped they might understand. They're children. Caleb moved to tend the fire, his movements deliberate. Understanding loss comes with age. I'm not lost to them, I protested. The Miller farm is barely 3 miles distant. Might as well be 300 to their thinking. He straightened, firelight casting his features in stark relief. When do you leave? Tomorrow afternoon. I twisted my hands in my skirts. Harold is coming with a wagon after the noon meal. Caleb nodded, still not meeting my eyes. I'll inform Samuel he's expected home for supper and to bid you farewell properly tomorrow. Thank you. I hesitated, desperate for some acknowledgement of what we were losing. Caleb, It's for the best, he interrupted, voice flat. You'll make a fine mother to Miller's son, and the children will adjust. They adapted to their mother's passing, they'll adapt to this as well. With that cruel comparison, he strode from the room, leaving me alone with the wreckage of what had once felt like family. That night, as I packed my belongings, I could hear Sarah crying silently in the next room, her sniffles muffled against her pillow. The sound followed me into fitful dreams of cradles rocking empty in abandoned houses. Harold arrived precisely at 1 o'clock the following day, his wagon freshly painted, harnessed to a handsome team of matched bays. He'd clearly taken pains with his appearance as well, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, wearing his Sunday suit despite it being Monday. His eager smile faltered slightly when confronted with the solemn tableau awaiting him on the Morgan porch. The children stood in a row by the door, their faces scrubbed pink, hair combed and slicked with water. Even Samuel had returned, though he stood slightly apart, shoulders hunched against the January wind. Caleb positioned himself behind them, one broad hand resting protectively on Sarah's tiny shoulder. Good afternoon, Harold called, his voice overly bright as he helped me into the wagon. Fine day for a new beginning, wouldn't you say? I forced a smile, unable to share his enthusiasm when faced with 5 stricken expressions, my trunk and carpet bag. All I possessed in the world looked pitiful in the wagon bed. Children, I said, turning toward them, remember what we discussed. I'll visit soon to continue our lessons, and you're welcome to call on me at the Miller farm anytime. Michael's lower lip trembled dangerously. You promised about my birthday. And I meant it, I assured him. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. The twins stepped forward in unison, presenting me with a small packet wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. We made it, Emma said, her voice quavering, so you won't forget us. As if I could, I replied, accepting their gift with hands that weren't entirely steady. Samuel shuffled forward next, his lanky frame awkward with restrained emotion. Ma'am, he said stiffly, offering a wooden box, for your sewing things. I recognized it as the project he'd been working on with his father, the dovetail joints perfectly fitted, the lids sanded satin smooth. "It's beautiful, Samuel, thank you." He nodded once before retreating, blinking rapidly against tears. A 14-year-old boy would rather die than shed publicly. Sarah remained motionless, pressed against her father's leg, her face half hidden in her doll's yarn hair. When I knelt before her, she turned away completely. "I understand you're angry with me," I whispered. "But I'll carry you in my heart every day, Sarah. That's a promise." She gave no sign of having heard me. "We should be on our way," Harold said, checking his pocket watch. "The boy will be needing his feeding soon." I rose shakily, turning at last to Caleb. He extended his hand with formal courtesy, as though we were mere acquaintances rather than people who had shared meals and conversations and the raising of his children for nearly 7 months. "Miss Foster," he said, his deep voice betraying no emotion, "may God grant you happiness in your new home." I took his calloused hand, remembering how those same fingers had crafted the iron bookmark he'd given me months ago. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Morgan." Something flickered in his gray eyes, something raw and wounded, before he released my hand and stepped back. For a breathless moment, I thought he might say more, might ask me to stay. Instead, he nodded curtly and turned to usher his children inside, closing the door with quiet finality. Harold clicked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward. I stared at the closing door, a hollow ache spreading through my chest. Not once during our farewell had Caleb truly met my gaze. The journey to the Miller farm passed in a blur of white landscape and stilted conversation. Harold pointed out landmarks with the eager manner of a man showing off his kingdom, but I absorbed little of his commentary. When we finally turned down a long drive flanked by naked oak trees, their branches stark against the winter sky, the farmhouse came into view. It was indeed larger than the Morgan home, with a broad front porch and multiple chimneys. Fresh paint gleamed white against the snow, and the windows were tall and numerous, all as Harold had described in his letters so many months ago. Yet as he helped me down from the wagon, I felt none of the excitement I might have anticipated during my journey west. "Welcome home, Elizabeth," Harold said, pressing a chaste kiss to my gloved hand. Home. The word rang hollow as an empty rain barrel. Inside, the house confirmed my first impression, spacious but lacking warmth. The parlor boasted fashionable furniture that appeared barely used. The kitchen contained gleaming copper pots hanging in perfect rows, and the dining room featured a polished table that could seat 12. Yet despite these material advantages, the rooms felt somehow abandoned, as though the previous mistress had departed, but her absence had never been properly acknowledged. "The housekeeper comes 3 times weekly," Harold explained, leading me through the downstairs rooms. "But she's no hand with the baby, I'm afraid. He's upstairs with Mrs. Pemberton at present, a neighbor lady who agreed to mind him until your arrival." As if on cue, an infant's thin wail drifted down the staircase. Harold winced slightly. "He's a bit colicky, poor lad. Never seems to settle properly." We ascended to a well-appointed nursery, where a gray-hailed woman paced with a swaddled bundle. Her relief at our appearance was palpable. "There now, Mr. Miller, your bride has arrived at last," she said, immediately transferring the squalling infant to my arms. "Perhaps she'll have better luck quieting him than the rest of us combined." Before I could protest, Mrs. Pemberton had gathered her shawl and was heading for the stairs, calling instructions over her shoulder about feeding schedules and diaper changes. The tiny boy in my arms continued to cry, his face mottled red with the effort, small fists waving in distress. I instinctively began to rock and sway, murmuring the same nonsense songs I'd used to soothe Sarah during nightmares. "That's Thomas," Harold said unnecessarily. "He favors his mother around the eyes, I think." I studied the infant's scrunched face, trying to discern any resemblance to the woman whose place I was taking. "He's beautiful," I offered, though truthfully all I could see was a desperately unhappy baby. "I'll leave you two to become acquainted while I bring in your trunk," Harold said, clearly relieved to escape the noise. "Your room is across the hall, the blue bedroom. I've taken the green room at the end of the corridor." I looked up sharply. Separate bedrooms? A flush crept up Harold's neck. "I thought That is until after the wedding, for propriety's sake. Of course, I said quickly, embarrassed by my assumption. That's very considerate. He departed with obvious haste, leaving me alone with Thomas. The infant continued to wail despite my efforts to comfort him. I checked his swaddling, found it dry, and tried offering a finger for him to suck upon. His cries only intensified. "You miss your mother," I whispered. "I understand, little one. Truly I do." For the next hour, I tried every soothing technique I knew, eventually resorting to a careful tour of the house, narrating each room to the distraught child. Nothing seemed to ease his distress. By the time Harold returned with a bottle of milk from the wet nurse in town, my arms ached and my nerves felt scraped raw. "He's been like this since birth," Harold explained above the crying. "The doctor says he'll grow out of it, but I fear our nights will be long until then." I accepted the bottle gratefully, settling into a rocking chair by the nursery window. As Thomas reluctantly began to suckle, his cries subsiding to hiccuping whimpers, I gazed out at the winter landscape. From this vantage point, I could just make out the distant smudge of Timber Creek on the horizon, the smithy's chimney releasing a thin column of smoke into the pale sky. A wave of loneliness crashed over me with unexpected force. I thought of the Morgan kitchen at this hour, the twins setting the table, Michael feeding the chickens one last time before sunset, Samuel splitting kindling for morning. I imagined Sarah standing by the window, perhaps watching for a wagon that wouldn't return, and Caleb at his forge, hammer falling in that steady rhythm that had become the heartbeat of my days in Timber Creek. Thomas finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath my hand. In the sudden quiet, the emptiness of the house seemed to expand around me like ripples in a pond. This spacious, well-appointed home contained everything I thought I'd wanted when I journeyed west. Everything except the family I'd left behind. I remained by the window until the light faded completely, watching that distant wisp of smoke until darkness swallowed it entirely, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. A week into my residence at the Miller farm, I found myself seated at the escritoire in the front parlor, staring at a blank sheet of stationery. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished wood surface. Thomas had finally succumbed to sleep after a night that seemed without end, his colicky cries only subsiding as dawn broke the horizon. I dipped my pen in the inkwell, poised to begin a letter to the Morgan children as I'd promised. "My dear children," I wrote, then stopped, the words appearing woefully inadequate on the cream-colored paper. How could I possibly convey what I wished to say? That I missed the chaos of their household? That Tomas's cries, though heartbreaking, failed to pierce my heart the way Sarah's silence had? That the grandeur of the Miller farmhouse felt hollow compared to the modest warmth of their home? I crossed out the salutation and began again. "Emma, Hannah, Samuel, Michael, and Sarah, I trust this letter finds you well and attending to your studies and chores with diligence." My pen halted once more. The formal tone felt wrong, as though I were addressing strangers rather than children who had climbed into my lap for stories, who had hidden frogs in my apron pockets, who had slowly opened their wounded hearts to me over months of shared meals and lessons. The clock on the mantel ticked away precious minutes of solitude. Soon Thomas would awaken hungry, and Harold would return from the fields for his midday meal. Yet I remained frozen, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like platitudes, or worse, reveal the growing hollow in my chest that expanded with each passing day. I recalled the twins' faces, streaked with tears as I departed. Had they kept up with their reading? Was Samuel still struggling with his arithmetic? Did Michael remember to feed the chickens without being reminded thrice daily? And Sarah, dear, solemn Sarah, had she retreated completely into the silence that had enveloped her after her mother's death? The thought of her regression twisted something painful inside me. 3 times I'd begun writing, and 3 times I'd balled the paper and started anew. Nothing I wrote seemed to capture the truth, that I'd made a terrible mistake. A mistake I couldn't admit, not even to myself. I set down my pen and moved to the window, gazing toward town, though it lay beyond the line of distant trees. Harold had been nothing but kind, patient with Thomas's constant crying, considerate of my adjustment to my new home. Yet an unbridgeable distance remained between us, as though we were actors playing roles neither fully believed. The wedding was set for early March, after the worst of winter had passed, nearly 5 weeks away. Each time Harold mentioned the preparations, a weight settled in my stomach, like river stones. With a sigh, I returned to the desk and gathered the crumpled attempts, consigning them to the fireplace. Perhaps tomorrow I would find the right words. Perhaps tomorrow the ache would lessen enough to allow me to write without revealing too much of my heart. In Timber Creek, Caleb Morgan worked his forge with singular intensity. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against glowing iron carried down the town's main street, drawing glances from passers-by unused to such ferocity from the normally measured blacksmith. Inside the smithy, sparks flew as metal yielded beneath his relentless pounding. Sweat streamed down his face despite the January chill. His shirt sleeves rolled above powerful forearms streaked with soot. "Easy there, Morgan," Fred Wilson called from the doorway, leading a dappled gelding. "You'll split your anvil at that rate." Caleb barely looked up, plunging the red-hot horseshoe into the water barrel. Steam hissed angrily as he grunted a non-committal reply. "Just need the off-front reshod," Fred continued, tethering his horse to the ring outside. "Threw it yesterday on the North Trail." He eyed the pile of completed shoes stacked by the forge. "Though, seems you've enough stock to outfit every horse in the territory." Caleb wiped his brow with a forearm, inadvertently smearing soot across his face. "Been keeping busy." "So I hear." Fred glanced around the smithy, noting the unusual tidiness of the space. "How are the young'uns managing? Townfolk say they've turned right proper since Miss Foster's departure. Hardly recognize them as the same wild brood." Something dangerous flickered in Caleb's eyes, but he merely nodded curtly. "They're managing." Fred shifted uncomfortably under the blacksmith's gaze. "Sarah still not speaking? My Hannah mentioned—" "She speaks when necessary," Caleb interrupted, lifting the cooled horseshoe with his tongs to inspect it. "Bring the gelding inside. I'll see to him now." As he worked, methodically removing the damaged shoe and preparing the hoof, Caleb's thoughts circled like hawks over the same barren landscape they'd traversed since Elizabeth's departure. The house stood spotless, the children performed their chores without complaint, meals appeared on the table through their combined efforts, all evidence that they were managing quite well without her. All lies. The children maintained perfect behavior, not from sudden maturity, but from the desperate, childish belief that goodness might be rewarded with Elizabeth's return. They spoke in hushed voices, completed their lessons without prompting, even argued less amongst themselves. Samuel had taken to overseeing his siblings with grim determination, as though Elizabeth's responsibilities had fallen directly onto his young shoulders. The twins prepared simple meals, and even Michael remembered his chores without reminders. Only Sarah showed outward rebellion, refusing to practice her letters despite Samuel's patient coaxing. "Not without Miss Foster," she would say, the only words she'd spoken since Elizabeth's departure. Then she would retreat to the window seat, staring down the road toward the Miller farm, her rag doll clutched to her chest. Caleb drove the first nail with more force than necessary, causing the gelding to sidestep nervously. "Whoa there," Fred cautioned, stroking the horse's neck. "Something got under your skin today, Morgan?" "Just focused on the work," Caleb muttered, gentling his approach with the remaining nails. The truth was, everything had gotten under his skin since watching Elizabeth drive away with Harold Miller. The winter seemed colder, the days longer, the silence in the house deeper. He'd told himself it was for the best, that Elizabeth deserved the security and position Miller offered, that his children would adjust as they had to their mother's death. He'd been wrong on both counts. Elizabeth's absence had revealed how completely she'd woven herself into the fabric of their lives. It wasn't just the cooking and cleaning they missed, but her gentle guidance, her quiet strength, her way of making each child feel specially seen. As for Caleb himself, he dared not examine too closely the hollow ache that had taken up residence beneath his ribs. "There," he said, patting the gelding's flank as he finished setting the last nail. "That'll hold him." Fred studied the work with approval before leading his horse back outside. "Much obliged." He hesitated before adding, "Church socials coming up end of month. Might do you and the children good to attend. Get your minds off recent changes." Caleb merely grunted, already turning back to his forge. The thought of facing the town's pitying glances, or worse, seeing Elizabeth on Miller's arm, soured his stomach. Yet the children needed normalcy, a reminder that life continued despite loss. He plunged another iron bar into the glowing coals, waiting for it to reach the perfect orange-red heat that made metal malleable. If only hearts could be reshaped as easily as horseshoes, hammered into more convenient forms that didn't ache quite so persistently. That evening, as I prepared a simple supper for Harold and myself, Thomas finally sleeping in his cradle nearby, I found my thoughts drifting once again to the Morgan household. The twins would be setting the table about now, Michael gathering eggs for breakfast, Samuel bringing in firewood for morning. A familiar pang squeezed my heart. I'd meant to write today, had promised myself I would overcome whatever strange reluctance stayed my hand. Yet another day had passed without word to the children who had come to mean so much to me. Tomorrow, I resolved firmly. Tomorrow I would find the right words. 3 Sundays passed before I gathered courage to attend services at Timber Creek's small church. Harold had suggested we might worship in Riverton, where his banker and business associates attended a larger, more refined congregation. But I'd demurred, citing my promise to visit the Morgan children. In truth, I'd been a coward, delaying the inevitable encounter. 3 begun letters remained unfinished in my desk drawer, and the promised visit to continue the children's lessons remained unmade. Each day I found reasons to postpone. Thomas was colicky, the weather threatened snow, Harold needed assistance with accounts, all excuses to avoid facing what I'd left behind. The February morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight gleaming off fresh snow as Harold helped me into the sleigh. I'd taken particular care with my appearance, wearing my best blue wool dress and the fur-trimmed bonnet that had been my single extravagance before journeying west. The knowledge that I would see Caleb again after nearly a month's absence had my stomach fluttering with nerves I refused to name. "You look lovely," Harold remarked, tucking a laprobe around us against the chill. "Blue brings out your eyes." I thanked him absently, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. Thomas, bundled against my chest, slept peacefully for once, his tiny breaths warming my neck beneath my collar. The church bell was ringing as we arrived, calling the faithful to worship. Harold handed me down from the sleigh with solicitous care, his pride in escorting me evident in his bearing. Heads turned as we approached the church steps, whispers following in our wake. Poor Constance barely cold in her grave. Scandalous how quickly he replaced her. The Boston teacher who was jilted. I kept my chin high, though heat climbed my neck at the poorly concealed gossip. Harold seemed oblivious, nodding pleasantly to acquaintances as we entered the small sanctuary, and then I saw them. The Morgan family occupied their usual pew midway down the right side. Samuel sat tall, his shoulders squared beneath a jacket that seemed too small, evidence of a recent growth spurt. The twins wore matching green dresses I'd helped them sew, their copper braids neatly plaited. Michael fidgeted beside them, tugging at his Sunday collar until Samuel stilled his hand with a pointed look. And Sarah, my heart caught at the sight of her solemn little face, pale beneath her woolen bonnet. She clutched her Bible with both hands, her gaze fixed on the hymnal rack before her. At the end of the pew sat Caleb, more formally dressed than I'd ever seen him, in a dark suit coat, his usually unruly hair slicked back with pomade. Even from a distance, I could see the new lines etched around his mouth, the slight hollowing of his cheeks beneath his neatly trimmed beard. Harold guided me to a pew near the front, nodding cordially to the Morgans as we passed. I risked a glance at Caleb, but his eyes were fixed straight ahead, his jaw set in the rigid line I recognized from our most difficult conversations. Throughout the service, I felt the weight of stares against my back. Some curious, some judgmental, some from 5 pairs of eyes I'd grown to love. Pastor Walsh's sermon on faithfulness and covenant barely penetrated my awareness, my thoughts scattered like leaves in a windstorm. When the final hymn concluded and the congregation began to disperse, I turned, unable to delay the encounter any longer. Harold was immediately engaged in conversation with the banker from Riverton. leaving me momentarily alone with Thomas in my arms. It was all the opening the Morgan children needed. "Miss Foster!" Michael reached me first, nearly bowling over an elderly deacon in his haste. He threw his arms around my waist, nearly crushing Thomas between us. "You came back." "Careful of the baby," I cautioned, adjusting Thomas in my arms while returning Michael's embrace with my free arm. "I've missed you too, but mind your strength." Emma and Hannah converged next, their words tumbling over each other in their eagerness to share news. "I've been practicing my stitches just like you showed me. Samuel's been helping with our sums, but he's not patient like you. Mrs. Wilson gave us a new book, but the words are awfully big." I smiled through the tightness in my throat, drinking in the sight of them. "You both look lovely. Those green dresses turned out beautifully." "We finished the seams ourselves," Emma said proudly. "Only Samuel had to help with the buttonholes." Samuel approached more slowly, his adolescent dignity warring with obvious delight at seeing me. He stopped an arm's length away, hands shoved in his pockets. "Ma'am," he said with a short nod that tried for manly restraint. "The house stands empty without you?" Coming from Samuel, the simple statement carried more weight than the twins' effusive greetings. I touched his arm lightly, noting how the sleeve rode up to expose his wrist. "You've grown taller." A hint of pride crossed his features. "Pa says I'll need new clothes by spring." I longed to ask more about his studies, whether he'd continued the woodworking project we'd started, if he still read by candlelight after the others slept. But a small movement caught my eye as Sarah peered around Samuel's legs, her doll clutched to her chest. I knelt carefully, balancing Thomas in one arm while extending my other hand to her. "Hello, Sarah, I've thought of you every day." For a moment she merely stared, her gray eyes so like her father's, solemn and assessing. Then, with deliberate slowness, she placed her small hand in mine. "The letters won't come right," she whispered, "not without you." Tears sprang to my eyes unbidden. "Perhaps I could help you practice again soon." Hope bloomed across her face. "Tomorrow?" Before I could answer, a deep voice interrupted. "Sarah, don't pester Miss Foster." Caleb stood behind his children, his expression carefully neutral. "She has responsibilities at her new home." I rose to face him, suddenly conscious of the infant in my arms, living evidence of my choice to leave. "Mr. Morgan, how are you faring?" "Well enough." His gaze veered briefly to Thomas before returning to my face. "And you, Miss Foster?" "Miller Farm suits you?" "It's comfortable," I replied, the inadequacy of the word hanging between us. An awkward silence descended, broken only when Harold appeared at my elbow, having concluded his business discussion. "Morgan," he greeted with a cordial nod. "Fine service today, wasn't it?" "Indeed." Caleb's response was clipped. "Children, we should be heading home. Dinner won't prepare itself." "But Miss Foster just got here," Michael protested. "She hasn't even told us about the baby yet." Another time, perhaps. Caleb's tone brooked no argument. "Miss Foster and Mr. Miller have their own obligations." I wanted to object, to tell him I could spare a few moments more, but the careful distance in his eyes stopped me. This was his way of protecting his children, and perhaps himself, from further attachment to a woman who had chosen another path. "Actually," Harold interjected smoothly, "Elizabeth mentioned her wish to continue the children's lessons occasionally. Perhaps she might call on Tuesday afternoon, if that's convenient." Surprise registered briefly on Caleb's face before he mastered it. "That's for Miss Foster to decide, if she can spare the time." "I'd like that very much," I said quickly, hope fluttering in my chest. "If you're agreeable." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps. The children would welcome it. "Only the children?" The words escaped before I could reconsider their impropriety. A muscle worked in his jaw as our gazes locked. For one breathless moment, the careful mask slipped, revealing such naked longing that my heart stumbled in my chest. "The house has been quiet without you," he admitted, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. Before I could respond, Thomas stirred against me, his face scrunching in preparation for the wall I'd grown to anticipate. Harold immediately placed a protective hand at my back. "We should get the little fellow home before he disturbs the whole congregation," he said, guiding me toward the door. "Tuesday, then? Around 2 o'clock?" I nodded, reluctantly allowing him to lead me away, casting one last glance over my shoulder at the Morgan family. The children waved enthusiastically, but Caleb stood motionless, watching our departure with an expression I couldn't decipher at that distance. The sleigh ride home from church stretched longer than the miles warranted. Caleb drove with mechanical precision, responding to his children's chatter with monosyllabic answers that eventually dampened even Michael's enthusiasm. By the time they turned up the lane to their modest house, silence had settled over the family like fresh snow. Samuel helped his siblings from the sleigh, while Caleb unhitched the horse. The boy had taken on responsibilities beyond his years these past weeks, stepping into the void Elizabeth's departure had created. Watching his son's shoulders square beneath burdens no 14-year-old should bear filled Caleb with a mixture of pride and regret. "Pa?" Samuel's voice broke into his thoughts as they led the horse into the small barn. "Is Miss Foster really coming Tuesday?" Caleb concentrated on removing the harness, his fingers working automatically at the familiar buckles. "Mr. Miller seemed to think so." "But will you let her?" Samuel pressed. "Teach us, I mean." Caleb hung the harness on its peg before turning to face his son. In the dim light of the barn, the boy's features appeared sharper, more defined, less child, more young man with each passing month. "Why wouldn't I?" Samuel shrugged, reaching for a brush to groom the horse's frost-rimed coat. "You've been different since she left. Angry-like." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. "I've been concerned for you children," Caleb deflected. "Changes are never easy. It's not just us you're worried for." Samuel's hand stilled on the horse's flank. "You miss her too." The simple statement, delivered with a child's devastating directness, cracked something in Caleb's carefully maintained composure. He turned away, busying himself with unnecessary adjustments to the tack hanging on the wall. "Miss Foster made her choice," he said flatly. "She found something better than keeping house for a blacksmith and his children. Can't fault her for that." "That's not why she left." Samuel's voice carried a certainty that made Caleb turn back in surprise. "She left because you told her to go." "I did no such thing," Caleb protested. "Emma heard you." Samuel resumed brushing the horse with long, sure strokes. "The night before she went to Miller's. Emma couldn't sleep and came down for milk. She heard you tell Miss Foster she should accept his proposal." Shame burned through Caleb like forge fire. He'd believed he was doing right by Elizabeth, encouraging her toward the security and position a woman of her quality deserved. Instead, he'd driven her away with his stubborn pride and misguided nobility. "Sometimes grown men make mistakes, son," he admitted, the words scraping his throat raw. "Terrible mistakes." Samuel nodded solemnly. "Like letting Miss Foster go." Yes. The admission felt like setting down a burden he'd carried too long. Like letting Miss Foster go, his children had seen what he'd been too blind to recognize. That Elizabeth belonged with them, not out of necessity or convenience, but because she had carved a place in their family that no one else could fill. She'd brought order to their chaos, yes, but more importantly, she'd restored light to a home that had grown dark with grief. And he'd sent her away, straight into the arms of a man who'd betrayed her once already. "Can you fix it?" Samuel asked, the brush slowing as he waited for his father's answer. "Like when you mend broken things in the forge?" Caleb ran a hand through his hair, dislodging the careful styling he'd applied before church. "I don't know, Samuel. Some breaks can't be mended." "But you'll try." His son's eyes held a hope Caleb hadn't seen since Elizabeth's departure. For all of us, for the first time in weeks, Caleb felt something stir within him, a resolve that burned hotter than his forge. "Yes, son, I'll try." He didn't know how, not with Elizabeth promised to another man, not with his pride and her wounded heart standing between them. But seeing her today, the careful politeness barely masking the sadness in her eyes, had confirmed what his stubborn heart had known all along. He'd made a terrible mistake, letting Elizabeth Foster go, and somehow he had to find a way to bring her home, not as his housekeeper, but as something far more precious.